From the top rope and the Great American Bash, I bid you all good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you may be in this great land of ours or around the world. Welcome to the $55 million studio. I'm the Pro Wrestle Machine. Whether you're a longtime fan reliving these monumental events or a newcomer eager to understand wrestling's rich history, you're in the right place. This episode is packed with insights, opinions, and a few surprises along the way. Let's get into this issue. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. July 5, 1999 Wrestling Observer Newsletter, WWF King of the Ring Review, Njpw names new president, more. By Dave Meltzer. In its first pay-per-view show since the ill-fated Over the Edge and the bevy of lawsuits filed since that time, there were some noticeable changes in the World Wrestling Federation for King of the Ring. Whether they were good, bad or coincidental depends upon your points of view, but the show itself was well below the usual standard for a WWF, or for that matter a WCW or ECW pay-per-view event. The biggest change was a much more careful in-ring style. There were a few big bumps, but not many, and all done more carefully. Some of this may be due to the fact Mick Foley wasn't on the show after double knee surgery, and he usually takes the lion's share of that type of move. It seemed like everyone was wrestling under control, as even the best match from a wrestling standpoint with the Hardy Boys vs. Gangrel and Christian was toned down from what you'd expect these same teams to do on a typical Raw show. In addition, for a nearly 4-hour show, with the exception of Chyna, who worked the show in the role of a male wrestler, there were no women on the card. Considering just how much of WWF's marketing thrust and success has been with Sable and Sunny, and their successors, there is no way that was due to sheer coincidence, particularly when women were out in full force the next night on Raw. The fans live did get to see the PMS trio, since Meat worked a dark match before the start of Heat. The King of the Ring tournament, which admittedly didn't look good on paper, was even worse in practice. WWF threw in a monkey wrench, apparently because logic seemed to indicate a Mr. Ass vs. X-Pac final, since the former Billy Gunn has been in line for a push as a heel since his turn, and for one reason or another things got stalled and were taken in different directions. X-Pac is the WWF's perennial hot tournament loser in the finals because he's the company's best in-ring performer and generally puts up exciting battles before losing, and the WWF was going with logic. Perhaps a few too many people figured it out. As last week went on, suddenly word came out that there was a video box cover for the upcoming King of the Ring tape with Big Show on the cover of the box with a caption stating "See the Big Show go through 8 men en route to winning the King of the Ring." Since word spreads fast these days, which in hindsight appears to have been a plant, this made Paul White something of a favorite going in. As it was, the King of the Ring matches were rushed with the exception of Road Dogg vs. Chyna, which was the only thing close to an average match in the tournament, and how would you expect going in for a show where X-Pac works 3 times all against decent to good workers, Hardcore Holly, Dog and Mr. Ass, and doesn't even get one average match out of the 3? And the fact the matches were rushed seemed really strange, with the show ending 22 minutes early. The show ended, after some teases, with the McMahons winning the handicap ladder match over Steve Austin to get control of the company. Shane took a few good bumps and has made a really good accounting of himself generally in the ring. Vince didn't take any outlandish bumps, but even 2 months shy of his 54th birthday, he looked as good in the ring as some of his trained wrestlers. Austin never fails to work hard in a big show main event, and this was no exception. It was good for what it was, but it was hardly the show-stopping main event Austin can have with a real wrestler. Undertaker vs. Rock was limited by Undertaker's physical limitations at this stage of the game. The show drew a legitimate sellout of 19,761 fans to the Greensboro Coliseum, announced as 20,018 on television, which was 18,574 paying $574,200 and another $110,692 in merchandise. The attendance record fell shy of the city record of 21,427 in the building and 20,268 paid, set for a sellout in the same building on April 27, 1998 for the Unforgiven pay-per-view, but it broke the gate record of about $380,000 set for the Starrcade '86 show. Speaking of history, there was a historical theme, not quite accurate. But since this business rewrites its history and someday it may become regarded as such, talking about 4 generations of McMahons that have run the World Wrestling Federation. This presumably would start with Jess McMahon, the grandfather of Vince Jr., who was a boxing matchmaker during the period when boxing at the Garden was a huge deal in the 30s, and did have a minor connection with pro wrestling but was never considered a pro wrestling promoter, and Capital Sports under Vince Sr., which later became Today Titan Sports in 1982, didn't even exist until the 50s, and the name Worldwide Wrestling Federation, predecessor to WWF, which as a name came around 1980, dates back to 1963 when Capital Sports pulled out of the National Wrestling Alliance. It was also interesting when referring to Shane McMahon that Jim Ross talked about his Ivy League education, which was the same storyline that Vince himself used about himself in publicity during the 80s, claiming a fictitious Harvard MBA and a silver spoon childhood, and that was considered cool among movers and shakers. In the late 90s, when that was no longer cool, Vince reinvented himself as an abused child who grew up poor, suffered from dyslexia, and was sent away to military school, which is at least a lot closer to accurate than him ever attending Harvard. And if that wasn't enough, during the broadcast, Ross made reference to the glory days of the Greensboro Coliseum, talking about the Briscoes, the Andersons, Wahoo McDaniel, Ricky Steamboat and Jay Youngblood, and of course Ric Flair, but then finished with the tagline that none of them had ever drawn 20,108 to the building, which is accurate because the building in those days only held 15,500 before renovation. Starrcade 86 actually drew close to 19,000 in the building because they had about 3,000 fans in the adjacent building watching closed circuit. At the same time, even to this day, there was never a show in Greensboro that probably could have sold more tickets than a Steamboat and Youngblood vs. Argent Slaughter and Don Coronado match in 1983, which caused one of the biggest traffic jams at that point in the history of the city, and reports at that time indicated somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 fans were turned away after the early sellout. The live show opened with a dark match with Meat, Sean Stippich, pinning Kurt Angle. Angle was said to look like someone who would have been a major star as a babyface in the 70s. In the first match on Sunday Night Heat, Matt and Jeff Hardy went to a no contest with Christian, Jay Resso and Edge, Adam Copeland, in 128 when the Acolytes ran in and attacked both teams. After the match, Bradshaw challenged Mr. Ass on Raw the next night for possession of the other tag team title belt. Mideon, Dennis Knight, and Viscera, Nelson Frazier Jr., beat Big Boss Man, Ray Traylor, in 147 when Mideon, who came to the ring wearing the European title belt, hit Boss Man with the belt and pinned him. Viscera splashed Bossman after the match and he was double-teamed until Mark Henry and D'Lo Brown made the save. Road Dogg did an interview for his King of the Ring match with Chyna. Chyna and Hunter Hearst Helmsley came out. Chyna slapped Dogg and then, after Triple H distracted him, gave him a low blow until X-Pac ran in. I can see how Inside Edition last year found 1,639 crotch chops during a season of Raw, since X-Pac did about 302 on this show alone. Prince Albert, Matt Bloom, pinned Val Venus, Sean Morley, in 157 of a street fight when Draws shoved Venus off the top rope. Albert didn't even get to deliver his famed what-a-ta maneuver for the pin. Godfather made the save. Ever since he lost the IC belt, he'd been in dire need of a program. Anyway, the brawling with Godfather and Draws was something to behold. Ken Shamrock beat Shane McMahon via DQ in 43. Shawn Michaels earlier in the show announced this as Shamrock vs. Vince, but Vince wanted a suitable replacement of someone else, which wound up being Shane. Shane was looking worried the entire show since it was decreed that no member of the CM could interfere or Austin would get 100% of the stock. Steve Blackman interfered with a zillion kendo stick shots on Shamrock, who was coughing up blood. Usually how this is done in wrestling is a condom filled with blood is brought to the ring and at the opportune time, you bite the condom and the blood comes out of the mouth. 1. In the first King of the Ring match, X-Pac, Sean Waltman, beat Bob Holly, Robert Howard, via DQ in 302. There was no heat for the match except for X-Pac's Bronco ride spot, but it was all action. Holly was DQ'd for a chair shot, as if they can't even do a clean finish in a Holly match. As far as the story aspect, they could have had a pin and still done the post-match with the same end result. After the match, Holly gave X-Pac a neckbreaker, giving him the neck injury to sell for the rest of the show. Isn't that the same angle they just did with Shamrock the previous match? Dud. 2. Kane, Glenn Jacobs, pinned Big Show, Paul White, in 636. This was like the kid behind the counter on the Starburst commercial who was bummed because El Nino rained out the summer and says, "I'm running in slow motion, to your rescue." Can't they dump that commercial already? El Nino was last year's gimmick. Show wrestles more like Andre every day, and that isn't a compliment as he was missing moves all over the place. In a spot right out of an Ernest Miller Nitro match, both guys went for high kicks at the same time, which would have been tricky with good wrestlers, and anyway, both missed by about a foot and both fell down. Even the fans, who wanted to love everything, were having a hard time figuring out how to react to this. Kane did do an enzujiri earlier. Ref Jimmy Corderas tried to get into position to be bumped, and ended up being hit one spot too early when Kane flailed his arms. They went right to the planned ref bump spot next, which after the previous spot looked beyond lame. Kane used a low blow. Holly came down with a chair after show. Kane took the chair and choke slammed Holly. Kane then choked Show forever. And more importantly than that, Kane clocked him with a chair for the pin. -1 star. 3. Mr. S, Monty Sop, beat Shamrock in 3:37. Shamrock was said to be injured from Blackman earlier and bleeding from the mouth in a pre-match angle where he threw around the paramedics. Even with this angle, the match had no heat. Mr. A basically beat up Shamrock the entire match, until missing a splash off the top. Shamrock went for the Hurricane Rana, but was power-bombed and started bleeding from the mouth again. This time they had a ton of blood coming out, and ref Teddy Long stopped the match. Shamrock of course threw Long out of the ring after the match. This finish was apparently taken from the Shamrock vs. Vader match at the FMW Stadium show in 1997 when Shamrock had legit internal injuries and was power-bombed by Vader about halfway into the match and started coughing up blood. This was legit, and they stopped the match. 1/2 star. 4. Road Dogg, Brian James, pinned China Joni Lauer in 13:19. This was actually the best match of the entire tournament, which speaks volumes for this tournament. Hey, at least when it was over, Mabel didn't win. China was on offense almost the entire match and her forearms are solid and she lays her kicks into the point they are borderline scary. Still, at one point Dogg taking big bumps off her whips was like 2 weeks ago seeing Flair take the big bumps for Piper's lame offense. Triple H distracted Dogg allowing China to throw Dogg into the post. Triple H then threw him into the steps twice. There still was little heat for the early part of the match except for a spot where China did Dogg's stutter step knee drop spot. The match momentarily fell apart when Dogg made his first comeback because China's selling is not exactly her strong point. Dogg got the sleeper on but Triple H put China's foot on the ropes for the break. Michaels came out and stopped Triple H from interfering. China went for a low blow, but Dogg no-sold it and China sold like her forearm was hurt. Dogg then pulled out a protective cup, showed it to the fans and used his pump handle slam for the pin. The finish, partially due to Michaels, had a lot of heat. 1 3/4 stars. 5. Hardy Boys beat Edge and Christian in 4:49 in a match where the winners were to get a title shot at the Acolytes. It was a fast-paced good match but way too short, and considering the show ended up early, it's hard to understand why. Highlight was Edge spearing Jeff off the middle ropes just before the finish. Jim Ross sold it like it was the greatest spear on earth. We'll probably see 30 replays of it over the next week. I guess that's why WWF is the best at what they do. They find ways to get people over. How many replays have we seen of that sick juvie driver off the ropes that Juventud Guerrera did to Blitzkrieg that may have been the best move in the States all year and what was probably the best match in the States all year? And how many times has any WCW announcer tried to put that match over? And how many times have we even seen either guy since that match? And Eric Bischoff can't figure out why his side has so much talent, and is losing so badly. Gangrel and Michael Hayes were brawling outside the ring for the finish. Gangrel drank that red liquid we're supposed to believe is blood, and blew it at Jeff, who ducked, so it got in Edge's eyes. Jeff then used a move that looked to be more like an ace crusher or a diamond cutter, which Ross called a neck breaker, on Jeff for the pin. 2 1/4 stars. 6. Ass beat Kane in 5:25 in a King of the Ring semifinal. No heat again. There were 2 nice spots during the match. Ass dropkicked the ring steps that Kane was holding, and he fell over with the steps on him. Kane later dropkicked Mr. Ass off the apron and he crashed into the barricade. During the match, Ross was talking to Lawler about going to court over the name King. This was a famous court case many years ago. At a time Lawler hated the WWF and he sued successfully to keep the WWF from ever referring to anyone. Harley Race was the guy in particular since he'd won the 1986 King of the Ring tournament. As king in the state of Tennessee since Lawler for years had been known to all wrestling fans under that gimmick. Finish saw Big Show come out and aimed a chair shot at Ass and then swung the chair about a foot higher and hit Kane in the face and Ass pinned him. 1/2 star. 7. X-Pac pinned Dogg in 3:08. This on paper looked to be the best match on the card. As it was, the interviews were longer than the matches. They were selling the idea X-Pac had a neck injury from the neckbreaker spot after the Holly match. Nothing much to this. X-Pac got out of the pump handle slam and turned it into an X-Factor for the pin. 3/4 star. 8. Undertaker Mark Calloway pinned Rock, Dwayne Johnson, in 1910 to retain the WWF title. Mike Chioda got decked by Undertaker before the bell, and Rock used a rock bottom on Undertaker but no ref. This would be the storyline idea that Rock got 3 pins on Undertaker but all 3 times there was no ref. Earl Hebner ran in but at the count of 2, Paul Bearer pulled him out of the ring and Bearer decked Hebner. Undertaker choke slammed Rock, who kicked out of the pin. This was a slow-paced match. Taker suplexed Rock on the floor. He also crotched himself doing the rope walk spot. Rock spit water in Taker's face. They brawled in the crowd. Rock picked up a chair, and this spot was really mistimed. Taker wasn't ready for the ring bell, so Rock had to hold up his chair shot. Except he didn't and instead gave Taker this weak love tap with the chair to wake him up for the spot. Taker grabbed the bell and Rock hit the bell with the chair, so the chair ricocheted back in Rock's face. Bearer hit Rock twice with his shoe. Taker hit a great DDT. Rock came back with his own DDT and clotheslined ref Njpw. He hit the people's elbow but again no ref. Taker came back with a low blow and Bearer sprayed ether on a towel. Rock got the towel and put out Taker with it. However, Triple H ran in and gave Rock a pedigree and sort of put Taker on top. Njpw came to and Rock kicked out. However, Taker then used the tombstone for the pin. 1.5 stars. 9. Ass pinned X-Pac in 5:33 to win the tournament. X sold his neck from the start. He did use a pescado early but then Ass worked over the neck. X-Pac kicked out of a misapplied Famouser and Gunn kicked out of an X-Factor. Gunn used a neckbreaker, went to the top but X-Pac dropkicked him. X-Pac climbed up for a superplex spot but was thrown off. Gunn used a Famouser off the middle rope for the pin. There was no ceremony or anything much on this show to put over like Gunn had really done anything big. 1.25 stars. 10. Vince and Shane McMahon won the handicap ladder match with 100% stock in the company over Steve Austin, Steve Williams, in 1711. They had done a storyline throughout the show that Shane was injured and that Vince would bring out a surprise partner. In the tradition of other big WWF pay-per-view surprises, Jimmy Snuka, Rockabilly, Wayne Gill, Sable as her own mystery wrestler, out came Blackman to collective groans. They showed Shane backstage just fine and Vince got the shocked look at Michaels ordered Shane to do the match. It was mostly brawling. They set up an entrance structure of a bunch of ladders that was obviously meant for it to be destroyed. Austin whipped Vince and Shane into one ladder after another until he pulled a cord and they all fell on Vince and Shane. Shane took a really cool bump backwards over the announcer's table. Austin took a very controlled bump from halfway up the ladder onto Shane through the Spanish table. He climbed up the ladder again and Vince shoved the ladder over so Austin slammed onto the English table, cutting his back open and the table didn't break. Austin slammed McMahon off the ladder. At one point Shane got on Vince's shoulders in this pathetic attempt to grab the briefcase. Finally Austin delivered stunners to both and climbed the ladder, but whoever was in control of the rope pulled the briefcase too high for Austin to reach. Austin went after Mark Eaton, the timekeeper. Finally Austin and Vince were both climbing the ladder and Shane shoved the ladder over, climbed up, grabbed the briefcase, and ran off. After the show went off the air, to send the live crowd home happy, Triple H ran to the ring and Austin stunned him about a dozen times. 2.5 stars. In what appears to be nothing more than a cosmetic change, New Japan announced to the newspapers at noon on June 24 on the eve of starting their new series, that Tatsumi Fujinami would be replacing Seiji Sakaguchi as company president. The reality is that it was Riki Choshu who was the main power in New Japan and Riki Choshu who is the main power. It appears the cosmetic reason for the change is that the New Japan vs. UFO angle, and in particular, the Shinya Hashimoto vs. Naoya Ogawa match, will probably start being put together to build for a big October show at the Tokyo Dome. The story is that Choshu wanted to put the deal together but that Sakaguchi stood in the way. Choshu then maneuvered Fujinami into the position. Where that is intriguing is that by its history in recent years, New Japan as a major business entity has always used wrestlers who were college graduates as its business heads, such as Sakaguchi, Masa Saito, Choshu, and Hiroshi Hashi. Fujinami, who was a high school dropout and became a protege of Antonio Inoki and trained to become a pro wrestler starting at the age of 16, goes against that formula. It was said there was a meeting of the New Japan stockholders that morning, but the reality is the biggest current stockholder in the company is Antonio Inoki and he wasn't at the meeting. There is also an idea floating around to try and put several of the major wrestling organizations under one umbrella and make Antonio Inoki into the figurehead commissioner of wrestling, where he'd try to add safety measures to what is basically an unregulated industry. Since many current fans grew up seeing Inoki and Fujinami as a tag team, and virtually all fans in Japan who didn't grow up seeing it know the legend of the two together, from a fan's standpoint, It makes a good story to see them working together as businessmen, although one could also say the same since Inoki and Sakaguchi were a regular tag team in the 70s, but that wouldn't give the illusion of new changes impending. Sakaguchi was given a new title of chairman of New Japan. Sakaguchi was given the title of president of the company in June of 1989 when Inoki won a seat in the Japanese Diet Senate. About the time Choshu took over as the booker, and the company experienced tremendous growth at the gate due to the success of the Tokyo Dome shows, which were the biggest money house shows in the history of the industry, peaking in 1995 to 1996 with the UWFI vs New Japan angle, which was actually the angle Eric Bischoff saw and recreated actually more successfully for long-term business in the United States. Over the 10-year period Sakaguchi was the figurehead in charge, New Japan was a profitable business every year. At the same time, New Japan's status fell as a television entity, losing primetime television and suffering ratings declines until an upswing in ratings over the past 2 years. New Japan, while still putting impressive gates on the board, has fallen into second place when it comes to mainstream popularity in the sports entertainment/fight world genre in Japan, behind K1. The idea publicly is that Sakaguchi, 57, resigned his position to put New Japan in the hands of a younger man. Fujinami, 45, however, has an older concept of wrestling based on how he was taught in his own glory years in the ring, which ended in the late 80s, although he was given the IWGP Heavyweight title last year as kind of a nostalgia kick on Inoki's retirement show at the Tokyo Dome, as shown when he ran his own Muga promotion shows from time to time, doing a very basic 70s style work in the ring. At the press conference, Choshu talked about attempting to put together a joint show with All Japan. There is still no date even being speculated upon, and there are numerous political headaches in the way of that deal being completed, but it has the potential to be one of the biggest deals in wrestling history if completed. And Fujinami talked about promoting a Hashimoto vs Ogawa match. They had done angles previously involving Sakaguchi and Ogawa, which led fans to believe that they hated each other and that Sakaguchi was against any involvement of UFO and Ogawa in New Japan rings, stemming from the January 4th match with Hashimoto, which broke down into a shoot, at least in some form. And Hashimoto was injured and out of action until recent weeks. Exactly what was and wasn't a shoot in that Hashimoto-Ogawa confrontation is speculative at best. Clearly Hashimoto and Ogawa went into the ring knowing what the score was. It was not a double cross in the ring. Ogawa was clearly fighting for real, and ref Masao Hattori and Hashimoto knew to set up the ref bump spot when things got out of hand and Hashimoto didn't want any more, the idea being making Ogawa into a legitimate pro wrestling drawing card. Hashimoto seemed to want out earlier than Hattori was willing to call the match. I don't believe most of the wrestlers involved in the post-match were, based on their reactions, in on anything. Hashimoto took a very bad beating in the process, breaking his nose, and literally having the tough guy reputation that led him to headlining more big money live shows than any wrestler who ever lived take an even bigger beating. To return, he's had to drop 50 pounds and attempt to almost reinvent himself. It is also very clear that the wrestlers involved in the situation were even more shocked than the fans at how everything went down. The New Japan wrestlers themselves, believing Ogawa wasn't a professional in how things went down, had been pretty adamant about not wanting him back on one of their shows, so that was a political hurdle management needed to get past in pro wrestling's never-ending quest to sell the match the public wants to see. In addition, New Japan appears to be building toward doing a Riki Choshu return against Onita, probably at the January 4th Tokyo Dome show. In addition, there has been at least talk of bringing Nobuhiko Takada back to traditional pro wrestling for a match on the August 28th show at Jingu Stadium. New Japan actually in a weird way acknowledged this when at the series opener at Korakuen Hall the next day. The company claimed Takada would not be wrestling on the stadium show and blamed the media for leaking the rumor before negotiations were completed for killing the deal, and tried to express upon the media the idea of not releasing information of that type until the deals are completed. While there are reports that this change has something to do with or in some way affects the New Japan/WCW deal, the change has zero to do with it. It's mainly cosmetic in nature for both the UFO angle and as a way to set up a possible bridge of Inoki returning to the company, or them putting the Wrestling Commission idea together with Inoki as the figurehead. At this point there is no change in the deal as it pertains to the United States. Fujinami is expected to fly to the United States soon to look at WCW talent to get more familiar with them. New Japan's feelings and relations with WCW have been strained for some time since they have a booking deal with the company, but WCW sends them little if any big-name talent. New Japan has been wanting to book Bill Goldberg, for example, for a Dome show, and names like Hulk Hogan, Kevin Nash, and Sting, who have current popularity in Japan, are also never booked for big New Japan shows. Although New Japan hasn't needed the help at most of their recent dome shows, which have sold out without big-name foreigners except Scott Norton and New Japan creation Don Frye as headliners and Brian Johnston and Dr. Wagner Jr. in the middle. WCW has sent Meng and Norton, who are both much bigger stars in Japan because Japan has the kind of workers that can make the powerful tough guys who aren't very agile have good matches, but few others. For the most part, this problem is because for decades, the big money in wrestling was generally in working Japan. Due to pay-per-view and merchandising being so big in the US, that is no longer the case. The top wrestlers don't want to work the physically harder Japanese style because of the injury risk, and there is no longer the financial incentive to do so. There have been backdoor feelers sent by New Japan to WWF in case the WCW deal falls through. The problem is from a Japan standpoint, while WWF is probably hotter with the hardcore Japanese fans since it's the better product and Raw has some cult popularity since it's on a cable station from Hong Kong that airs in Japan, WCW has more talent depth. If WCW got its act together, there are good wrestlers they could send, they don't, but that's another story, to Japan that would fit in. WWF doesn't have the depth and use basically its entire roster of top guys on every weekend house show, and doesn't have a flock of people under contract that can work Japanese style at close to the New Japan level that aren't working the weekend shows. WWF is better organized, but when it comes to sending top talent to Japan, isn't necessarily going to be any more advantageous. In what in some ways may turn out to be a larger story in the long run for New Japan, TV Asahi announced they would be airing 2 major television specials in August for the G1 Climax tournament. The finals of the tournament would air live as part of a 2-hour special on August 15th starting at 3:30 p.m. The house show itself from Tokyo Sumo Hall starts at 3 p.m. To promote New Japan's first live television appearance on the network in 7 years, there would be a 90-minute special starting at 4 p.m. the day before, which would air highlights of G1 tournament matches held up to that point going into the show later that night. The last time New Japan aired live on network television was for the January 4, 1992 show headlined by Choshu vs. Fujinami. New Japan shows air weekly on Saturday nights, usually at around 2 a.m. It got the 2 weekend afternoon time slots based on the rating for the April 10 Tokyo Dome show, which peaked with a mind-boggling 9.9 quarter at 2:45 a.m. for the Onita vs. Masahiro Chono explosive barbed wire match. There were winners and losers when it came to network appearances this past week, with Vince McMahon appearing on both The Today Show and Conan O'Brien on NBC on June 24, Rena Mero appearing on Jay Leno that same day, and Hulk Hogan appearing the previous night for the full hour on Larry King Live on CNN. Hogan, appearing for the full 60 minutes, for the PR coup for WCW with a great, if transparently self-serving and oftentimes dishonest, performance with King, a show which has been criticized heavily by television critics for Hogan getting an entire 60 minutes with claims of conflict of interest due to CNN and WCW both being under the Time Warner umbrella and claiming the news show shouldn't have been used for an appearance that had no news value and was strictly for promotional purposes for a sister company. Mero, who literally had nothing to say, didn't fare well on Leno. McMahon was a mixed bag, appearing as a concerned businessman on Today, but coming off as nervous and stiff, even worse if possible than Mero, trying to trade comedy barbs on Conan. Neither late-night appearance came off as the slightest bit newsworthy. McMahon was interviewed by Matt Lauer on The Today Show, arranged by the WWF, like the Conan show, as a promotional appearance for King of the Ring. However, Lauer wasn't interested in talking about the show, which was never brought up, and the entire interview regarded the death of Hart. When Lauer talked about pro wrestling being popular, McMahon interrupted, claiming it isn't pro wrestling that's popular, but it's the WWF, borrowing a 1980s advertising slogan the company was using during the last boom period. McMahon claimed that Hart never expressed concern to anyone in the company over doing the stunt. There is no confirmation or even indication he expressed concern to anyone in management, but it is just as clear he did to several wrestlers and to several others who were backstage, including Harley Race. McMahon said if Hart had expressed concern, they wouldn't have done the stunt, pointing out Hart rehearsed it earlier in the day. He blamed the lawsuit on the family being too quick to go, the attorneys saying he and his wife Linda were prepared, and still are prepared to make a financial settlement, saying it would be the right thing for her, Martha, and Owen's children, but wouldn't admit to any responsibility, saying people should wait for the investigations to be completed. He said he told Martha that over the phone the week after Owen's death and tried to contact her again later with a settlement and were told to contact the attorneys in Kansas City. When shown a clip of Jesse Ventura on the same show saying that today's pro wrestling was getting out of control, and said if they wanted to do stuntman spots that the wrestlers should be trained as stuntmen and be part of the stuntman's union. If they were, a man as inexperienced as Hart wouldn't have been allowed to do the stunt in question. McMahon responded saying Ventura has been out of the business for some time and maybe he's not up to speed on current conditions. McMahon called Hart's ring entrance a routine thing, comparing it with Peter Pan and Garth Brooks, and then noted Time Warner's wrestling company has done it dozens and dozens of times with the same rigor. At this point in time to still try and compare the stunt WCW has done with Sting and others, which used one of the same rigors but was a different stunt and had backups in place, to this stunt, which didn't, is almost insulting. Lauer brought up comments Bret Hart's about the direction of wrestling made on the show, and McMahon responded by labeling Hart as disgruntled, saying his popularity has plummeted since leaving the WWF and said he's got a personal agenda. Mero, appearing on Leno later that night, was advertised in TV listings all weekend and NBC promos as Sable, but that night Leno called her Rena Mero, the artist formerly known as Sable. She got only a tepid reaction and showed very little in the way of charisma or personality in the setting to an audience that didn't really seem to know who she was or really care. It was a real reality check as to her being able to make it outside the choreographed confines where all she had to do was look a certain way and dress a certain way and she'd be a star. She claimed the obscenity and vulgarity in the WWF had gotten out of hand and said she'd never participate in the WWF again unless things changed. When asked about the name Sable, all Mero said was that it would be up to the courts to decide. Leno said that he hoped she wins her lawsuit. McMahon, on Conan, plugged the pay-per-view show and seemed ill at ease, but the hosts were generally kind of him just making fun of his shocked look on Raw, and asking logical questions about illogical storylines such as if he runs wrestling why he doesn't simply make himself the world champion. He said it would hurt the credibility of the WWF, which he didn't mean as a comedy line but the audience laughed, and why he simply doesn't fire Austin if he hates him so much. He said they already tried that and it didn't work. He ripped on Ted Turner and came off bad doing so since it was totally out of the context of the comedy the rest of the interview was, and subjects like Hart and Rena Mero were never brought up. The most newsworthy of the interviews was Hogan on King. Hogan was smooth and his delivery was excellent. Aside from nearly everything he said being self-serving and a good portion untrue, if it wasn't for him trying to take seriously the presidential thing and using the word Polak, which ended up making him look bad, the appearance would have been a pretty sizable PR coup for both he and WCW. The Polak word came when Hogan was asked about where he got the name Hulk Hogan. He told the story that he had quit wrestling because he was disgruntled about making $125 per week and sleeping in his car, presumably his days working for Jerry Jarrett, and Terry Funk talked him out of it and put him in contact with Vince McMahon Sr. That story also isn't true, but that's another thing. He said when meeting McMahon Sr. that McMahon wanted him to dye his hair red and become Hulk Hogan, saying he got the name Hulk because he was bigger than Lou Ferrigno and The Incredible Hulk was a popular TV show at the time. The first time I saw Hogan wrestle in the late 70s was out of Alabama as Terry the Hulk Boulder, and he couldn't work and had so-so charisma, but it was clear because of his size that there were very few men of that height in wrestling in those days, and none had what would be by today's standards an impressive looking physique since steroid abuse was in its infancy, and look, that he was a can't-miss superstar and Irish hero since McMahon had Bruno Sammartino for the Italians, Pedro Morales for the Puerto Ricans, Chief Jay Strongbow for the Indians and Ivan Putski for the Polacks. Hogan came under heavy criticism for that line from the Polish National Alliance, saying it was a derogatory term and he should have used either Poles or Polish people, comparing it to the dreaded N-word for African Americans. Hogan had a spokesperson respond saying Hogan himself didn't say the word but that he was repeating what McMahon Sr. had said in their conversation nearly 20 years ago and it was McMahon Sr. who had used the word. It's doubtful any of that was true either. Funk's connection with Hogan occurred at least a year before he went to the WWF and had nothing to do with setting him up with a meeting with McMahon. Hogan, as Terry the Hulk Boulder, was talking about quitting wrestling over being frustrated about not making any money, and Funk talked him out of it, gave him the name Sterling Golden, and introduced him to Jim Barnett, who was promoting in Georgia and got him his first national exposure. Funk also suggested Hogan, at the time working in the WWF as a heel and as a regular with New Japan where he was becoming a huge draw, to Sylvester Stallone for the role in Rocky III, which was a minor reason. This was overrated in many people's eyes because Hogan's AWA popularity was going through the roof and he was already a big money player for New Japan before the movie was ever released. Hogan became the biggest draw in the American business for Vern Gagne before leaving Gagne for McMahon Jr. in December 1983. The idea that a guy who looked like Hogan did in 1979, when he first made the connection with McMahon, who had what everyone in wrestling knew was the perfect look if a promoter could create a wrestler out of cloth, but his interviews and ability at the time were somewhat suspect, would be asked to change and dye his hair red is preposterous. With the tan and the blonde hair and the body when it came to that kind of size that was totally unique in wrestling at the time would have been a natural post-superstar Graham heel for the WWF and Vince Sr., who was by no means a dumb man when it came to promoting wrestling, and certainly Vince Jr., who was wielding a lot of power by that time, would have never at that point in time wanted to tinker with what was so obvious right before their eyes. That's probably Hogan coming up with a story based on Vince Jr. wanting Bob Backlund to dye his hair and turn heel in 1984, Backlund being fired when he refused. Hogan said he left the WWF due to being singled out with McMahon for the steroid controversy, leaving out that he actually quit because McMahon wanted him to pass the torch in the ring to Hart and he wasn't going to lose at that time to what he perceived as a little guy, although at this point one would almost be sure he'll put Hart over now because in a program the only way Hogan can get over is to put Hart over, and said that athletes in every sport used steroids and continued to use steroids even after the law was changed, making it felony. When asked if he continued to use steroids after the law was changed, Hogan said that he had, but I'm not sure if from his reaction he didn't misinterpret King's question. He claimed he signed with WCW when doing the show Thunder in Paradise, and just by coincidence they were taping in Orlando at the same time he was filming, and just by coincidence somebody stopped by and asked a question and they filmed him, and just by coincidence, you get the picture. He said he came in and immediately the numbers changed, that is true, and then when he went heel and joined the NWO, it took off, also true. He strongly hinted throughout the show wanting to return as a full-fledged babyface. He put over Eric Bischoff and Ted Turner and knocked the WWF for pushing the envelope, exploiting women and devil worship. He started calling WWF 30 porn but then stopped himself. He said the WCW method would win in the end and claimed people like he and Bret Hart would be working together to make wrestling suitable entertainment for children again. He hooked himself to Hart's name constantly in the interview, given the feeling within the business that Hart at least initially is going to have tremendous popularity with wrestling fans due to sympathy over his brother. In what appeared to be a cleverly set up spot, King said to Hogan regarding Owen Hart, "You were very close to him," and Hogan bowed his head. Hogan never said he was, nor denied it, but the impression was certainly given the audience that he was. He said what Hart's drop was supposed to be was a spoof to make fun of Bret and himself. Hart's role was clearly designed to be that, but the stunt was to spoof Sting, and that Owen wasn't trained for that stunt and was a good enough wrestler that he didn't need to be put in that position. They showed a clip of Martha Hart from her appearance on Larry King and said he agreed with her, and again talked about he, Bret, and Randy Savage getting their heads together for the good of the industry, and brought up again that the industry should get away from exploiting women. When the Sable lawsuit was brought up, Hogan noted that stuff was drawing ratings and basically said the people in charge put morals aside and go with what works for business. He said that he can't let his children watch WWF and said the American public would get their belly full, and said how WCW promotes a product that kids can watch. They showed a clip of Jesse Ventura from his appearance on the show talking about Hogan going to Vince to nix the union. Hogan said Ventura's story was totally false, and said Ventura's stories about his wrestling career get bigger and bigger as time goes by. He said Ventura always complained about money, even going back to the AWA days. He categorized Ventura as a mid-card wrestler, who only had main events on occasion when he wrestled against him. Not true, as Ventura and Adrian Adonis in the AWA days before Hogan came were frequent main eventers when Vern Gagne as AWA champion didn't work a full schedule of house shows, and later Ventura has a main event run in WWF with Backlund, was a main eventer frequently in Oregon, although he worked probably as many matches, probably more during his career in the middle as on top. He said Ventura talked about unionizing going back to the AWA, but there was never any serious talk of a union, and it was never a deal that was close to happening. Hogan said there was a time in the WWF when they were wrestling at Wembley Stadium and Ventura was talking about a union strongly. For the record, WWF only ran one show in its history at Wembley Stadium, in 1992, during a period when neither Hogan, on hiatus over the steroid controversy, nor Ventura, fired by McMahon 2 years earlier, were even with the company. The union story occurred in early 1986. WWF never even ran Wembley Arena until 1991, and there were no dates for any arena in London during the period when this is alleged to have gone down. He blamed Ventura for having a grudge against him because Ventura asked him to help him campaign when he was running for mayor of Brooklyn Park, and due to his own political affiliations at the time, he didn't. He finally threw the biggest dig at Ventura, saying they were friends at one time, and in the old days, we, on the road, always went to Jesse's room to party because he had everything to party with. Although his candor was suspect, he was doing well until the presidency thing came up and he tried to take it seriously. He claimed the people at Time Warner wanted to get him to run for president. When asked who, the only name he would come up with was Eric Bischoff. He said he never committed to running, then said he'd made the announcement he was running on Jay Leno when a clueless King said he could make the announcement on his show, then said when he first made the announcement on wrestling it was a publicity stunt but now it's serious, then said 6 different contradictory things about whether or not had announced it or would be running. When King scoffed at his ability to debate people like Al Gore, he said he admitted he'd have to have people bring him up to speed. Again, when it came to a platform, he knew little to say except flat tax and putting America first. Regarding McMahon, Hogan said, "I have a lot of respect for how he's taken care of his family. As far as a businessman, his theme of ride the horse until it drops, shoot it, then eat the horse, I don't agree with." He said he didn't think he could go back to the WWF because there are too many hidden agendas there, like there aren't in WCW. By the end he was talking in circles again, mixing the work and the shoot. He freely admitted wrestling was choreographed at the beginning, imparting the McMahon/Hogan system of admitting to wrestling being fake/I used steroids/I cheated on my wife, things to make the interviewer think you're being candid, and then turn the rest of the story and the past history into complete fiction. Later he was talking about his loss to Goldberg and injury at the hands of Page as if they were real. King asked him if he was worried about getting hurt in the ring. He said early in his career when he wrestled overseas, particularly in Japan, he'd have to watch out because a guy could make a big reputation in one night taking him out, but said today in WCW that would never happen. Then after saying nobody in WCW would ever hurt him intentionally, he talked about how DDP hurt him intentionally. Then he said he wasn't mad at Page. In other words, he's decided against that program, but said he wanted to wrestle Goldberg on July 11th. That isn't going to happen and nobody at WCW knows why he pushed something that was for sure not going to happen. He sort of knocked Goldberg, but very carefully, saying he's not sure where his head is at. He again talked about Hart. Hogan called Hart over the past week and laid out a program idea where they would work against each other, both as old-style superhero babyfaces, leading to a three-way program involving Goldberg later this year. Said he could wrestle in his 50s, is that a scary thought or what? And tried to tie himself to Hart once again. Due to a computer system failure at Nielsen, television ratings for June 28 were unavailable at press time, although given what each show had to offer, it is a ridiculously safe bet it close to if not the biggest blowout in the history of the Monday Night Wars. For July 5, due to the weekend holiday, there is also a good chance ratings would be delayed and unavailable in next week's issue. For the weekend of June 26th and 27th, Livewire did a 1.8 rating, Superstars did a 2.0 and Sunday Night Heat before the pay-per-view show did a 4.14 rating, WCW Saturday Night did a 2.0, for those wanting to credit Dusty Rhodes for the 1.9. As if people tune in specifically to see the announcers, after much lower numbers earlier weeks, this number was up, without Rhodes, and was a 1-hour show which traditionally draws lower numbers than the 2-hour shows, and Thunder on June 24th did a 3.30 rating, which is Thunder's best mark in many weeks. An interesting note regarding WWF running programming that is supposedly more kids-oriented on the morning shows as compared with Raw, is that Livewire this week drew 651,000 non-adult viewers, Superstars drew 747,000 non-adult viewers and Heat drew 1,447,000 non-adult viewers on shows where language and behavior is toned down from Raw. Raw, the show that isn't edited because supposedly children are less likely to watch, draws more than 2.5 million kids every week. For the weekend shows this past weekend by percentage, WCW Saturday Night draws 80% adults, Livewire draws 61% adults, Superstars draws 63% adults and Heat draws 67% adults. The last figures we had for Raw, which were about a month ago, were 61% adults. WWF King of the Ring History. July 8, 1985 / Foxborough, Massachusetts, Don Morocco Def. Iron Sheik. July 14, 1986 / Foxborough, Massachusetts, Harley Race Def. Pedro Morales. September 4, 1987 / Providence, Rhode Island, Randy Savage Def. King Kong Bundy. October 16, 1988 / Providence, Rhode Island, Ted DiBiase Def. Randy Savage. October 14, 1989 / Providence, Rhode Island, Tito Santana Def. Rick Martel. September 7, 1991 / Providence, Rhode Island, Bret Hart Def. IRS June 13, 1993 / Dayton, Ohio, Bret Hart Def. Bam Bam Bigelow 1.1 by rate June 16, 1994 / Baltimore, Owen Hart Def. Razor Ramon 0.85 by rate June 25, 1995 / Philadelphia, Mabel Def. Savio Vega 0.65 by rate June 23, 1996 / Milwaukee, Steve Austin Def. Jake Roberts 0.6 by rate June 9, 1997 / Providence, Rhode Island, Hunter Hearst Helmsley Def. Mankind 0.5 by rate June 28, 1998 / Pittsburgh, Ken Shamrock Def. Rocky Maivia, 1.1 by rate June 27, 1999 / Greensboro, North Carolina, Billy Gunn Def. X-Pac. Note, shows prior to 1993 were local market house shows in New England with no national promotion. 1993 became the first time King of the Ring became an annual pay-per-view event. On November 7, 1985, WWF did a very similar event on pay-per-view that was at the time called the Wrestling Classic in Chicago, with Junkyard Dog beating Randy Savage in the finals. Mexico. The first epic confrontation between Kurgan and Giant Silva actually led to a crowd of 13,500 at Arena Mexico on June 25. The match was a 3-on-4 with Kurgan and Apollo Dantes and Universo 2000 and CN Cars beating Silva and Brazo de Plata and Mr. Njpw in a one-fall match which went 9 minutes when Dantes pinned Silva after grabbing a cane from the dreaded Man in Black at ringside and first giving Silva a low blow with it, then raking it through with the hook part again. Before the show, it had been advertised as pretty much a one-time only deal, at least for this time, since Silva was returning to the United States. His WWF deal has him working a few weeks at a time in Mexico, then coming home since his family lives in New Jersey, for 4 to 6 weeks. Silva and Kurgan worked against each other for 3 straight minutes, but Kurgan was horrible. Silva did do a decent drop kick and a splash off the top rope and is clearly improving and has charisma for Mexico to where he has the potential to remain a huge draw here. The semifinal saw the return of Pierroth Jr. teaming with Black Warrior and Villano Tercero to beat Atlantis and Negro Casas and El Hijo del Santo in 2 straight falls of a match which only went 6:24 total. Pierroth, who has been wrestling in Puerto Rico, now wears Puerto Rican colors and said over the house mic that he was Puerto Rican, which infuriated the Mexicans. They are building up an angle where Pierroth will feud with Mascara Anno 2000, climaxing with a hair versus hair match. V3 pinned Atlantis in the second fall to set up his challenging for Atlantis CMLL light heavyweight title. On the undercard, El Satanico joined with Rey Bucanero and Ultimo Guerrero to form a regular trio called the New Infernales, a famous team in the 80s that Satanico was part of. Perro Aguayo's final match ever in Tijuana will be July 1st, and that is a sure sellout. Main event is Perro and Perro Jr. against Sangre Chicana and Cobarde. A correction from last week. On the June 17th show in Toluca, Mezquera Sagrada Jr. won the Mexican national middleweight title from Espectro Jr. when interference from Miss Janet backfired. Some notes from the June 11th Triple Mania show in Madero. The second part aired on TV this past weekend in Mexico, and will air on July 5th in the United States. Los Vados Locos went to a double count out with Los Vipers in what was described as a typical ECW weapons match but had little heat. The man vs. woman Xochitl Hamada vs. Pentagon match, built up because they had a romance and one dumped the other, went 10-27 and was, despite the grudge billing, mainly a solidly worked technical match if you can accept the premise of a woman having most of the offense against a man. The finish was all screwed up with Pentagon selling a low blow that missed for the DQ. The only heat was when Pentagon would get behind Hamada and all sorts of lewd chants would start. Semi-main event was said to be 3.5 stars with Heavy Metal, Super over as a face, and Felino over Kickboxer and Thai Boxer in a match with referees Tropicasas, Metal and Felino's father, and Tirantes putting up their hair. The heels used nunchucks and then Tirantes handcuffed Tropicasas to the post. Felino got the keys to the handcuffs from Tirantes and unlocked Tropicasas, and they managed to handcuff Tirantes. René Guajardo, a Mexican wrestling legend of the 60s and 70s, who was serving as a ref, and he was knocked out as well. Out of the crowd came Tirantes' son, going by the name El Hijo del Tirantes. Felino power-bombed Thai Boxer off the top rope and he was stretchered out. Kickboxer pulled out the nunchucks and was destroying Tropicasas with them until Felino ran in, but he was disqualified, leaving Kickboxer versus Metal. Kickboxer was destroying Metal and Tropicasas wanted to stop the match to save his son by throwing in the towel, but suddenly Felino grabbed his father's hand to stop him. Metal recovered and scored a clean pin. Tirantes first ran off, but was then brought back and got his head shaved. The main event, which aired on June 28 in the US and the prior weekend in Mexico, was an Increíbles match with Perro Aguayo and Octagon and Cobarde over El Texano and Sangre Chicana and Perro Aguayo Jr., which wasn't much, although Perro Jr. did some cool dives. Dante's hair match with Pepe Aguayo, set for June 27 in Guadalajara, was moved back to July 4 when WWF called him in and wanted him up for this week's TV tapings. Dante's WWF contract calls for them to get first priority on his dates. This is a local Guadalajara angle since Aguayo beat Dante's younger brother Cesar Dantes in a hair match on June 6. This July 4th is an EMLL vs AAA head-to-head battle as AAA is taping TV in the same city and bringing back Hector Garza and Mocho Cota as the main will be Garza and Octagon and Felino, and Mascara Sagrada Jr. vs Killer and Jacques Mate and Texano and Cota. El Hijo del Santo will be touring Panama this week. Ringo Mendoza defends the CMLL middleweight title against Scorpio Jr., who is no middleweight, on July 2nd in Nezahualcóyotl. July 2nd at Arena Mexico has Pierroth and Villano Tercero and Dantes vs Casas and Atlantis and Brazo de Plata, Black Warrior and Fuerza Guerrera and Bestia Salvaje vs Shocker and Lismark Sr., returning after a lengthy absence due to his heart condition, and Njpw, Super Astro vs Blue Panther, the new Infernales vs Zorro and Tarzan Boy and Olympico and more. Los Hermanos Dinamita won a tournament on June 27 at Arena Coliseo to get a shot at the CMLL Trios title. All Japan. Nothing much in the way of news this week with things starting up on July 4th. Mitsuharu Misawa is wanting to bring in Yui Sano, Gedo and Great Sasuke as possible future opponents for Yoshinari Ogawa's PWF Junior title. The June 13th TV show, which was the Misawa Kobashi Triple Crown bout, drew a 4.6 rating, but the June 20th show fell to a 2.8. New Japan. In something of a surprise, the Freedom Dogs, Tatsutoshi Goto and Michiyoshi Ohara captured the IWGP Tag Team titles from Kensuke Sasaki and Shiro Koshinaka on June 27 in Shizuoka before a sellout 5,000 fans. Goto and Ohara were announced as Dog Gun Group, but wrestled without their usual foreign objects style, with the match ending with Goto pinning Koshinaka with his trademark back suplex in 12-12. Goto and Ohara had also beaten the champs in a non-title match on June 25 at Korakuen Hall when Ohara pinned Sasaki after a double-team powerbomb. Goto and Ohara then didn't wrestle on the June 29 New Japan show in Takasago, saying they don't want to be wrestling in non-title matches. Koshinaka at the show said he was going to reform his tag team with Kengo Kimura to challenge for the belts, since Goto, Ohara, Koshinaka and Kimura were all in the old Heisei Gun group together. Also in Shizuoka, Koji Kanemoto retained the IWGP Junior title, beating Minoru Tanaka of Battlerts in 14:38 after a moonsault. Fujinami backstage at that show reiterated that he was trying to put together a Hashimoto vs Ogawa match. On June 29, Fujinami missed the New Japan show in Takasago and instead went to the UFO show in Osaka. Masahiro Chono said in response to the presidency change that he still wants to kill everyone associated with New Japan. Chono also said that Atsushi Onita would be coming to the New Japan show on July 1 in Gifu. They are doing a big angle where Onita wants a shot at the IWGP heavyweight title, but New Japan doesn't want to give a shot at their serious world title to a gimmick guy with no wrestling ability. Onita ran his own indie show on June 27 at Korakuen Hall and said he'd go to the New Japan show and was looking for the title shot. Referee Katsuhisa Shibata had his retirement show on June 25 at Korakuen Hall and was given presents by the newspaper and magazine reporters along with Fujinami and Riki Choshu. He had worked in pro wrestling for 32 years, 11 years as a wrestler followed by 21 years as a referee for New Japan. His son is currently training to be a wrestler with New Japan. In the ring, he body slammed his son to basically introduce his son publicly as a future New Japan wrestler. The August 28 Jingu Stadium show will have lower ticket prices, $165 tops as opposed to $246, than Tokyo Dome shows, and is being called Gingu Climax Battle of last summer. June 5 TV show did a 3.5 rating and June 19 did a 3.0. June 12 was preempted. Other Japan notes. UFO ran June 29 at Osaka Furitsu Gym before a poor crowd of 2,000. It was reported as 4,800, but it was nowhere close, and even that was significantly papered. This show aired worldwide on the internet live on both AntonioInnoki.com and the NWA website in the United States. Because the technology isn't advanced enough, the sound quality was so-so and the picture quality was not even that, but apparently it drew 62,000 hits on the NWA website, so from an interest standpoint it was considered a success, but as a live event it was considered poor both from a show quality standpoint and due to the poor crowd. The main event saw Naoya Ogawa retain the NWA title, beating Gary Steele via a new spinning octopus submission in 8:05, which he supposedly developed while training in Okinawa. Gary Goodridge, who Ogawa faces on the Pride show on July 4, was at ringside and gave interviews to build up that match. After Ogawa won, he grabbed the house mic and started screaming about why Yoshihisa Yamamoto of Rings wasn't there and said he's going to have to go to Rings to get him. Inoki did not announce a return date for the promotion, only saying the next show would probably be in either England or the Netherlands. The UFO Big Van Vader, Sylvester Turkey, debuted beating Eric Ulrich in 2:10. Brian Johnson of New Japan jumped Vader, which again shows there is more to the relationship than people are letting on, setting up a feud between the two. Dan Severn beat Justin McCulley with a front guillotine in 8 minutes. Several of the indie groups are doing tournaments right now, including women's groups All Japan Women, the traditional summer singles Grand Prix, Neo Ladies Cup, some of the matches taking place this past week on Michinoku Pro Shows. JWP and Battlerts is doing a junior heavyweight tournament, I believe, to fill its vacant title, with men's Teo and Winger tied for first place with 7 points as of July 26. Rings ran June 24 at Korakuen Hall, drawing a sellout 2020 for a show in which the top 3 matches all went the time limit. Masayuki Naruse beat Hiromitsu Kanehara via points after 30 minutes, Ditto Gram Zaza beating Fulcon via points in 30 minutes, and Kiyoshi Tamura going to a 20 minutes draw with Yoshihisa Yamamoto as the main event. It'll be interesting to see the tape of this show. Han's matches in the past are never shoots. Yoke Castale upset former champ Bitsaje Terriel in 6:01 with an armbar in the rematch from last year's super match, with Rings Yasuhito Namikawa against Takada's Minoru Toyonaga saw Namikawa win in 9:51 with a front guillotine in what was almost surely a shoot. Michinoku Pro's Masked Man World League Tournament from July 17 to August 22. Participants will be Great Sasuke, Grand Naniwa, Tiger Mask, Superboy, Dirt Bike Kid, from England Black Warrior, Mexico, Cali Man, actually Chad Collier, one of Leigh Thatcher's guys from Ohio under a mask, Doc Chan, who may be Christopher Daniels, and Dos Caras. I'd also read somewhere that Jason Cross from England would be on this tour as King's Cross. Sasuke has talked about retiring if he doesn't win the tournament, and Tiger Mask said that he would unmask if he doesn't win the tournament. Onita worked twice on his own June 27 Korakuen Hall show, which drew a sellout 2,150. First, Onita teamed with Fake Onita and Samba Asako, losing to Shooter No. 1 and Masashi Aoyagi, who feuded with Onita in the early days of FMW 10 years ago, and Katsuji Ueda, for years Onita's real-life bodyguard, and then in the main event, a no-rope barbed wire street fight tornado double-hell death match, Onita and Shigeo Okamura and Asako and Mitsunobu Kikuzawa beat Genichiro Tenryu and Shoji Nakamaki and Ichiro Yaguchi and Hiroshi Ono when Onita pinned Ono after a Thunderfire powerbomb. Onita, who is keeping his name in the news at the age of 41 going back for his high school diploma, he dropped out at 15 to become a pro wrestler under Giant Baba, had all his high school friends at this show. Tiger Mask retained the British Commonwealth Junior title, beating Masaaki Mochizuki on the Michinoku show on June 27 in Kitagami. Urgent will be doing a one-night high flyer tournament on July 25 at Korakuen Hall with Tiger Dream, Candy Akutsu, Ayako Hamada, Mary Apache, Linda Starr, Mexico, Mika Akino, Gami Metal, Fujita, and Shaparita Asari. Mariko Yoshida defends the Queen of Urgent title against Asia Kong on August 6 at Tokyo Ota Ward Gymnasium. Hayabusa will not be working the next FMW tour and will instead be touring Mexico. It's basically building the idea that Hayabusa is so mad about being ordered to unmask and that he's going to Mexico. It's actually to build up the August 25 Sapporo House, which will be Hayabusa's first match without the mask and end the gimmick. On the June 15 FMW show, Hayabusa did a moonsault off the top of a ladder onto Haido that I'd estimate as being 7 feet off the ground. Since he was at the very top, Masato Tanaka and Tetsuhiro Kuroda were both holding the ladder steady. Mr. Ganasuke and Yukihiro Kanemura are doing a spot where they kiss each other on the lips, and they are using women, including a porn actress of at least some minor name value, similar to the role WWF does with its women. They also did an angle where Hill Commissioner Koto Fuyuki hit Masato Tanaka's arm with a hammer, and then Fuyuki said if Tanaka misses any matches or loses any falls on the next tour, he has to retire. There will be a tournament on July 31 at Korakuen Hall to determine the new FMW World Entertainment Wrestling 6-man tag champs. Ultimo Dragon's Toriuman promotion will be touring July 4 to July 16 with the biggest shows on July 11 in Kobe, Great Sasuke and Magnum Tokyo and Tiger Mask and Kenichiro Arai vs Shima Nobunaga and Sumo Fuji and Judo Suwa and Sasuke the Great, and July 16 in Yokohama Bunka Gym, Tokyo vs Fuji, Nobunaga vs Arai. The July 6 Weekly Pro Wrestling ran newspaper clippings showing Giant Baba challenging for 3 different major world titles during the month of February 1964. His February 8 match against NWA champ Lou Thesz at the Olympia, now Joe Louis Arena, in Detroit, His February 17 Madison Square Garden challenge against WWF champion Bruno Sammartino and his February 28 challenge against WWA champion Freddie Blassie at the Olympic Auditorium in Los Angeles. Shinya Kojika, when doing his Dory Boy gimmick with men's Teo as Terry Boy in the matches against Abdullah the Butcher on the Big Japan shows, wears his skull cap with the bald head and the little bit of hair up front like Dory's trademark. In one barbed wire match, they put the barbed wire in Butcher's mouth and began ripping it here and there. David McLean, who formerly ran both Glow and later POW Wrestling in the 80s, the former of which drew strong TV ratings in its first year before dwindling due to the novelty running out, but in many ways was the predecessor of what WWF does today, using very pretty silicone-enhanced models that can't work as wrestlers and the idea of doing silly skits between matches, looks to be getting back in business. He held a press conference in Los Angeles that was covered in a lot of newspapers about Reformation. He'd been attempting for years to get the thing back on the air, but with the success of Sable, people were finally interested. He had been wanting to use Lisa Moretti, Ivory, as his top star, who dates back to the Glow days as a 13 years younger Tina Ferrari, but WWF got her, so he brought out Selena Majors, Bambi, who has actually done pro wrestling for many years, and introduced her as his big star at the press conference. He's doing a cattle call type of audition, similar to what WWF did in Los Angeles a few months back with little results, and picking women to train as wrestlers. McLean said in his press conference that this would be a more dignified version of women's wrestling, that it won't have the peep show mentality, and nudity and dangerous stunts won't be part of the show. This group is different from the Torberg group that is still scheduled for pay-per-view shows on both August 29th and October 31st, which will probably be called WNWA, and is the one people like Howard Brody, Nick Bockwinkel, Brad Rheingans, Ken Resnick, who is no longer announcing roller derby as of the airing of the tapings, which took place this past weekend in Las Vegas, and they got a Los Angeles sportscaster who apparently is very good to take his place, and Joe Pedicino are associated with. For those of you with DirecTV dishes, Lucha Libre will become available on July 20th as Galavision at that point starts on channel 404, airing EMLL every Saturday, although the time changes depending upon programming, and AAA every Monday night, which seems to start at 10 p.m. Eastern, and Univision, which airs WWF Super Astros on Sunday morning, starts on channel 402. High Road Productions is just about ready for the final go-ahead in doing a 1-hour biography special on the life of Owen Hart, which would air on A&E in the US. The movie would not get into any of the controversy surrounding his death, but would cover his life and wrestling career around the world. High Road is the same company that did Wrestling with Shadows, which has won numerous awards as documentary festivals around the world. CNN Showbiz Today this past week did a feature on the movie, since its major home video release is, I believe, this week, and gave it a very strong review. Paul Lloyd, a wrestler and promoter in South Africa, was shot and killed on June 21st over a dispute over a woman. Former NWA and NCAA champion Jack Briscoe, 58, who was one of the biggest stars of the 70s, is recovering from emergency back surgery on June 21st. Everything at least temporarily seems to have been worked out regarding Jerry Lawler and Power Pro. Lawler and Randy Hales had a dispute over supposedly a promise made by Hales. When PPW was formed, everything was put in Hales' name, and Lawler made it clear to everyone he was not management but only talent, probably because the lawsuit was still upcoming revolving the folding of the USWA. With the lawsuit settled, Lawler, who was instrumental in getting the deal started, back on Channel 5 and with the talent agreement with WWF, was apparently looking for more power. He and his live-in girlfriend Stacey Carter, who were the stars of the show, pulled out, and Lawler made preliminary inquiries about getting television and figuring he could pull the WWF developmental guys his way as well. As it turned out, Lawler appeared on the June 19th TV show More to Talk About running for mayor of Memphis, but at this point Hales has told people Lawler is still with them, and Lawler made it clear he'd make his announcement one way or the other on Hales' show. There is still said to be underlying heat because of Doug Gilbert, who at one time called up Lawler and made violent threats toward him on his answering machine, being with PPW. Lawler has until July 15th to make an announcement, but considering how his interview went, it certainly seemed like he was going to run. Once filing, his wrestling appearances on Memphis TV would have to be pretty well eliminated due to equal time provisions. Lawler has an incredible gift of gab and quick wit and the ability to make himself likable when he wants to turn it on, plus is far more of a local icon figure in Memphis than Jesse Ventura would have ever been in Minneapolis. But still, Lawler as a mayor. Because of Jesse, none of the other candidates take him lightly and the media won't treat him as a goofy joke with no chance to win. Memphis criminal court judge Chris Kraft sentenced Donald Branch to 49 years in prison in a very well-publicized case for the 1997 drunk driving vehicular manslaughter death of the daughter, granddaughter and unborn grandchild of Memphis weatherman and longtime TV wrestling announcer Dave Brown. Branch's punishment, according to the judge, was so severe not because of Brown's celebrity status, which created a tremendously high visibility locally for the case, but because Branch was on probation, had 3 prior drunk driving arrests and was driving with a suspended license. He'll be eligible for parole in 2014. Brown was quoted in the June 29 Memphis commercial appeal as saying, "I guess we couldn't have asked for anything more from the system. The system failed early on, because he was still driving even with his earlier arrests. But now I think the verdict and sentence will help send the message that society's not going to put up with scofflaws who drink and drive." On the TV show, Brown opened saying there was a restraining order against Gilbert being on the show. Peggy Gilbert, Doug's mother, came out with a big box that obviously had a person in it that they teased was Doug. She came out with a box for an interview and Brown again reminded her Doug wasn't allowed to be there. Hales came out and Peggy mentioned that she's known Hales since he was 10 years old and president of the Tommy Gilbert fan club, which I believe is a shoot. Hales told Peggy that if Doug was in the box he'd be arrested. J.R. Smooth and Glenn Kulka wanted Doug to come out and threatened to slap Peggy. Tommy Rich then came out of the box and cleaned house and told Hales that he and Gilbert would face Smooth and Kulka in the main event that night of the new Daisy Theater house show, which ended in a no contest. Rich grabbed a chair and sat in the ring until Hales saw things his way, including hitting downtown Bruno and also laying out a security guy with a chair. Kid Wicked brought out a new valet called Siren, who towered over Wicked. Then again, Bill Dundee towers over Wicked, who seemed clueless. I have a feeling she might be Shannon Hall, who the WWF signed, since Hall was a former American gladiator that Siren was an AG name. Later in the show, when the heels knocked down Hales, Rich hit the ring and cleaned house, and Rich said the only reason he helped Hales was because Peggy Gilbert owed him too. This set up, with the crowd chanting "We want Doug," Hales saying for one night only he'd allow Rich and Gilbert to form a tag team against Smooth and Kulka. Chris Cannonball later that night beat Njpw of the BSK group in a hair versus hair match, which sets up challenging Smooth for the PPW title. The July issue of Mad Magazine has another Desmond Devlin feature with a pro wrestling backdrop. Actually, it's more about politics and wrestling connection, called the Jesse Venturification of politics. Anyway, I got a kick out of the line where they had Senator Storm Thurmond meeting up with Randy Savage and telling him he used to watch him wrestle as a kid. Dynamite Kid will be doing an autobiography that will be released in the United Kingdom in October. KPLR TV in St. Louis, which broadcasted wrestling literally for decades, most prominently during the Sam Mushnick era, is planning on doing a 1-hour nostalgia show airing tapes of old episodes of Mushnick's wrestling at the Chase Show. The station on the news leading up to the recent Raw show aired old footage from the show, and it drew the 2 highest ratings the newscast drew all year. ISBW will be running shows every Thursday night at the Wildwood, New Jersey Convention Center from July 15th to August 19th. The first show will include Little Guido, Spike Dudley, Steve Corino, Nova, Bushwhackers, Ace Darling, Devon Storm, Iron Sheik, Dawn Marie Bitch, Lance Diamond and Nitro Girls Terry Brine, Fire, and Sharmell Sullivan. Storm APW is doing afternoon and evening shows on July 24th in Susanville, California at Bally's Gym with Tatanka, Marty Jannetty, Brian Lee, and Bushwhackers. Wolfie D and Flash Flanagan are returning to Music City Wrestling as the Black Sheep. Rena Riggins, who formerly worked for the group, is running in competition in Nashville on July 20th with Tennessee Vols, Yokozuna, The Fabulous Ones, Condito, Tammy Sitch, Bushwhackers, and Head Shrinkers. NWA New England on July 10th at Harry Dalarusso Stadium in Revere, Massachusetts has Knuckles Nelson and Dukes Dalton defending the NWA tag titles against Public Enemy. Ted DiBiase and George South have a show on June 30th in Jacksonville, Florida at the First Baptist Church. We've got more of a finalized lineup for the Brian Hildebrand Benefit Show on July 30th in Rostraver, Pennsylvania. As it stands now, the main event will be Shane Douglas versus Chris Jericho with Mick Foley as ref, and it may turn into a 3-way if Foley has recovered fully from the knee surgeries. Chris Benoit and Dean Malenko versus Tracy Smothers and Chris Condito, Dirty White Boy with Alan Berry in his corner against Cody Michaels with Jim Cornette in his corner. Public Enemy versus Roger Anderson and Frank Parker, plus Dominic DiNucci wrestling underneath against Lord Zoltan. Among the guests confirmed on the show are Terry Taylor, Sandy Scott and Leigh Thatcher, and there will likely be more confirmed over the next few weeks. Westwater/Weiss Productions of Malibu, California is doing a movie based around wrestling called The Dalton Brothers, about 3 college wrestling champions who turn pro when Title IX eliminates their program. Craig Zellner, who is training under Thatcher, will play one of the brothers. Reports we're hearing about the WWO show on June 20th in San Jose, headlined by Pero Ogueyo's final appearance in the city, indicate the crowd at between 2,000 and 3,000 as opposed to the 1,600 reported on in the local newspaper. I already saw Jesse Ventura's autobiography in the discount bins at the local bookstore. In names from the past, a group called International Wrestling Alliance ran June 18th in Bossier City, Louisiana, using names like Coco Ware, Bushwhackers, Stephen Dunn, Tracy Smothers, Tommy Rogers, One Man Gang, Johnny Mantell, Iceman King Parsons, The Rock, and Roll Express, Sergeant Slaughter, Brian Blair and Stan Lane as Midnight Express 2000, and Bill Eadie worked as both Masked Superstar and as Bolo Mongol, a name he probably hasn't used since the mid-70s. Tony Hunter has a show on July 7th in Frederick, Maryland and July 8th in Salisbury, Maryland after local baseball games, with Ricky Morton versus Stan Lane main events. For those in the San Bernardino area, Killer Kowalski will make his first appearance at a wrestling show in Southern California in a long time, maybe like 25 years, on July 18th as a guest referee for an Empire Wrestling Federation show at the old San Bernardino Arena. MMA. The latest on the controversy regarding the main event at the next UFC is that Maurice Smith's team sent a CAT scan of Smith to Semaphore Entertainment Group, which forwarded it to Dr. Richard Istrico, the head doctor at all UFC events, who ruled that Smith had not suffered a recent concussion in the Peter Aerts K1 match and would be okay to fight. Istrico's opinion was forwarded to Mark Ratner, who heads the Nevada State Athletic Commission, that isn't sanctioning this event, but will be attending the July 16th show as a fact-finding mission on whether or not to approve UFC in Nevada, which is generally considered the meeting that will either make or break the event. The current UFC plans after July 16th are for a September 24th show in Montreal, followed by a show in an as-yet unnamed location on October 22nd, and ending the year with a December show, which theoretically, if all goes well as far as approval, would be in Las Vegas, and would likely also be the first show carried on most of the major cable systems. Also on the July 16th pay-per-view show, Ryu Takase, who has fought in Pride and Pancrase and is best known for a win over 680-pound Emmanuel Yarbrough, will face Jeremy Horn. Speaking of Yarbrough, the current issue of Sports Illustrated had a short on him, as he's now up to 728 pounds and was the biggest, at least in terms of size and notoriety, attraction at this past weekend's North American Sumo Championships in Los Angeles, which was taped for both ESPN and ESPN2. They gave the impression if he trimmed to 500 he could play in the NFL, which is a joke. It was mainly about his sumo wrestling, and never even brought up UFC, where he gained his most fame for being knocked down by Keith Hackney in probably the most famous blow ever delivered on a UFC show. That same issue ran a column by Rick Riley about the cross-dressing Thai kickboxer Njpw, who once fought Japanese woman wrestler Kyoko Inoue, who is undergoing the sex change operation with all the jokes, looks like Vicky LaMotta, punches like Jake, that you'd expect, including knocking the Thai kickboxing community as a spoof, which won't allow him to continue fighting if he undergoes the operation, saying it would be the greatest leap forward in the equality of the sexes since Sable. Actually, when he fought in Tokyo 2 weeks ago, there was a big controversy since he's taking female hormones and thus growing breasts and wanted to fight in a bra, but they wouldn't let him, and ended up wearing a sports bra as a compromise, and there was also a controversy about him weighing in topless. Frank Shamrock is in a full-page print ad for sports pharma supplements in the current issue of Muscle and Fitness. While it is common for both wrestlers and fighters to be endorsing numerous products of the like in Japan, it is the first major endorsement I've seen by a UFC fighter in the US. The next K1 show will be July 18th at Nagoya Rainbow Hall with Igor Vovchanchin, an MMA fighter whose specialty is kickboxing and has something like a legit 26-1 record and has won more MMA tournaments than any man alive, debuting against Ernesto Hoost plus Sam Greco, coming off his win against Mike Bernardo, facing K1 Grand Prix champ Peter Aerts in the main event, and a tournament with the winner getting a slot in the year-end Big Grand Prix event. Some notes on the pro wrestler from Battle Arts who is now billed as Karl Malenko, 29, formerly known as Karl Greco, who faces Egan Inoue in the Pride 6 show on July 4th from Yokohama Arena. He's not the son of Boris Malenko or brother of Joe and Dean, although he's being billed as such in Japan. His real name is Carl Ognibena from Winter Haven, Florida, and trained largely with Duzelberto, a former pro wrestler and later MMA fighter, and trained very little under Karl Gotch. He's got a 2-1 record in legit shoot matches in the US for the IFC. The Pride show may be the most looked forward to MMA show of the year, largely because of the curiosity involving both Nobuhiko Takada and Naoya Ogawa facing legit MMA stars in Mark Kerr and Gary Goodridge respectively. One would presume both matches to be worked. We've been told Goodridge's price for a job was too high and his match with Ogawa will be a shoot, but this makes absolutely no sense to risk Ogawa in such a situation with so many big money matches on his horizon. Although this was billed as a shoot match and for all I know, maybe it was, there was a match in Cleveland on June 25 under Pancrase rules on a show called Ultimate Wrestling with Dan Severn facing Brad Kohler, best known for his recent steroid arrest. Kohler has done both MMA fighting and was a good enough Greco-Roman wrestling to make it to the top 8 for the 1996 Olympic team trials at 220, and of late has started pro wrestling in Minnesota. Anyway, the match was said to be a war and Severn and Kohler tumbled over the top rope onto the floor with Kohler being knocked silly on the fall, and the match was stopped in 7:57 of a bout where Kohler was very competitive. Fans were throwing things at Severn. Severn was yelling at the fans to get in the ring, and amidst all this Severn was ruled the winner. It sounds like Severn was trying to get a more aggressive attitude down pat because he was encouraged to try and play a stronger heel in Japan for the UFO show on June 29 to where fans would see him as something different than they see him now for a prospective rematch against Naoya Ogawa. A June 22 Pancrase-style show at the Baja Beach Club in San Bernardino, California was raided by police with the promoters and one of the ring announcers arrested and cited since shows of this type aren't sanctioned in California, are being held fairly regularly at clubs in Southern California. This is the first where the show itself was actually raided by police. ECW. While this still has not been made at press time, the reports we have are that the announcement of the TNN deal was expected to take place on June 30 and the contracts were already signed this past week. As part of the deal, ECW will not be allowed to put its syndicated show on WGN in Chicago since it's a superstation, although there are still negotiations going on for Tribune to potentially syndicate the ECW package. ECW will start in its Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time slot on August 13 with a History of ECW show, and there will either be a second history show or a repeat of the first airing on August 20, with the first regular weekly show on August 27. TNN has an option to purchase 10% ownership in the company after 1 year. The contract is a 3-year deal, although in the television world that doesn't really mean anything. It basically means ECW can't go elsewhere for 3 years as long as TNN keeps it on the air. TNN can cancel any television show for bad ratings or whatever reason it sees fit. Things are still vague when it comes to exactly what will and won't be allowed on that station at that time slot. Blood will be allowed and extreme man-on-women violence won't be allowed, and in the middle is the vague gray area, but clearly ECW, at least in the early stages until and unless it gains power by drawing good ratings, the kind of power WWF has right now, isn't going to be pushing the envelope early. TNN also will earn a percentage of the increase in ECW gross business revenue over its current approximately $11 million per year. ECW will be paying for the production costs of the new show, which will average approximately $25,000 per week, for among other things, a new entranceway, better lighting and more banners. ECW will get 3 minutes of promotional consideration advertising and 2 more minutes of advertising each week, while TNN will retain the rest of the advertising time. When TNN's revenues from the show between ad sales and its cut of a possible business increase pass a certain level, then ECW will begin to get a percentage of the ad sales. Since TNN reaches Canada, ECW will get its first exposure in that wrestling stronghold, and its September 19th pay-per-view show will be the first one airing on Viewers' Choice Canada. ECW has also reached a deal with Pioneer Home Video to release ECW compilation tapes for stores. The July 18th pay-per-view lineup has been totally revamped. As things stand right now, the new main event will be Jerry Lynn and Rob Van Dam versus Justin Credible and Lance Storm, based on an angle to be shot this week, plus Taz versus Yoshihiro Tajiri for the ECW title, Super Crazy versus Little Guido, the Dudleys defending the tag titles against Balls Mahoney and a mystery partner, Danny During and Amish Roadkill versus Nova, and Chris Chetty and Jason versus Jazz in a man versus woman match. The June 26 show at the ECW Arena drew a packed house of about 1,350. It opened with Rhino, formerly Rhino Richards, pinning Christopher Daniels after a power bomb. Daniels was said to have looked better than in his first week in. Spike Dudley then pinned Rhino. Skull Von Crush beat Lance Diamond. During and Roadkill, with a new valet, beat Nova and Chetty when Chetty turned on Nova and started dancing like Ricky Martin, which is apparently going to be his new heel gimmick. A bikini contest with Francine and Dawn Marie Bitch, the new name she's going under, saw Francine come out. Justin Credible started nailing Tommy Dreamer with the stick as he was watching, and the girls went at it. Sabu and Bill Alfonso attacked Credible, and Storm came out winding up with Lynn making the save to set up an unsanctioned main event. Musco Delammer said beat David Cash. Guido beat Crazy due to interference from Tajiri. This set up Taz beating Tajiri, which was said to have been a very good match, which was good enough to make Tajiri into Taz pay-per-view opponent after a few more angles are done. Van Dam beat Mahoney in a match where the Dudleys interfered. Van Dam took one of the sickest chair shots ever from Mahoney. Mahoney took another bump through a table on fire lined with thumbtacks. Mahoney, from doing this at most of the shows of late, has a lot of noticeable burn marks on his back hidden by the fact he wears a shirt. Main event saw Storm and Credible beat Lynn and Sabu. Since the gimmick is Sabu is suspended from wrestling by all the commissions, it was said that this was a non-sanctioned match so he would participate. Credible pinned Lynn after hitting him with the stick and using Lynn's own cradle piledriver on him. The Queen's New York show on July 3rd is the last show in the building nicknamed the Madhouse of Extreme since it's being torn down. There was a meeting with the wrestlers before the show in Philadelphia. Paul Heyman basically thanked everyone for sticking with him through the bad times and the bounced checks, and that starting in September they would be doing 3 to 4 shows per week, but more 3 than 4. Tajiri is adding some great Muta mannerisms to his Masa Saito facials. Other house shows this week saw June 25th in Hartford, Connecticut draw 1,500 and June 26th in Trenton, New Jersey draw 400. TV this past weekend was the first of 2 shows from Villa Park outside Chicago. The crowd was excellent, which made for a really lively show. Spanish Angel brought out Jack Victory in a wheelchair as his manager for a match with Von Crush. Joey Styles said that Von Crush wasn't his real name and that he wasn't even German. He said it was a dumb name and they're looking for a new gimmick for him. They showed literally seconds of the match before Taz showed up. Victory ended up out of the wheelchair and attacked Angel. That was sure fast. Corino then came out and brought out Rhino, comparing him with Dick the Bruiser and the Crusher. Taz, who no-sold a power bomb at the start, then destroyed Richards in a one-sided 303 with some cool suplexes and a choke. Guido beat Tajiri in 7:49 with a crab after Sal E. Graziano interfered. Guido juiced from a few chair shots. Tajiri rubbed Guido's blood on his own stomach. This was a 3¼ star match, made even more entertaining because the crowd reactions were just super for this match. TV main saw Lynn pin Credible in 7:30 with a rolling reverse cradle after a series of reversals. They started with an angle where Storm came out and told Lynn to do the job as a favor since he drove him to the hospital after the pay-per-view match. Lynn laid down, but then tried to cradle Credible and the match was on. Surprisingly, this match didn't have anywhere near the heat of the Guido-Tajiri match, even though on the show itself, Guido and Tajiri were on later in the show. It was billed that the winner would face Van Dam. After a ref bump, Lynn used the Stone Cold Stunner and didn't get a good pop for doing so. The heat was still decent and it was a good match, but not on the level of most of their matches in the past. Storm ran in and they did a double team stuff piledriver after the match. The show and Angle were a major push for Storm and Credible as a team, and the push is definitely working. Paul Heyman is looking at giving Lance Diamond a new name and gimmick as Simon Diamond, doing a Simon Says type of gimmick and pushing Chris Chetty harder with a Ricky Martin dancing gimmick. WCW. Does it seem like everything is falling apart? Well, then why should this week be any different from any other? The Master P deal has turned into a colossal joke and may have already fallen apart. Last week in New Orleans, Master P kept making demands on WCW for more limos and more perks, trying to negotiate contracts. Apparently Swollen signed a huge money contract and Eric Bischoff actually believed the guy used to work for New Japan Pro Wrestling, although reports since he worked one show this past week were that he wasn't mad for a newcomer, showing less than zero respect for Bischoff. And then the next morning, one of his bodyguards was arrested at the airport for carrying a gun. There must have been a blow-up because by late week, it was said that both his and Dennis Rodman's appearances for July 5th at the Georgia Dome were in jeopardy. Both were still being advertised as of June 29th, but nobody seemed to know if they would appear or not. Actually, the latest inside word was that P was through, but that Swollen was at Nitro on June 28th, distancing himself from P since he was the one who was the real wrestling fan out of the group. Nobody had a clue about Rodman or what even the problem was in the first place. And if that isn't silly enough, they added Rick Steiner versus Van Hammer for the TV title at the July 11th pay-per-view, and there was talk of making Ernest Miller the US champion and having him work a program with Disco Inferno over the title. Scott Steiner was the champ, but due to his back injury, he's not expected back anytime soon. Speaking of back injuries, Ric Flair is supposed to be out of the ring. It's no secret Flair isn't thrilled with his current role designed to end his career, and quite frankly, Nash is the first booker who looks like he may succeed in this regard. Flair's back is legitimately hurt, and probably any wrestler who has been around as long as Flair could be examined by a doctor and numerous injuries found. Probably this is similar to Hogan in that Hogan did have a legit knee injury but took the opportune time to sit out. Flair is having an MRI done this week or next to determine the extent of the injury. He'll be kept on TV doing the goofy president role but won't be wrestling. However, unlike most of the injured wrestlers, Flair did go to all the cities he was booked at to make an appearance. In Auburn Hills, Michigan, he even sort of worked. They were doing a match with Savage versus Bagwell, but with both refusing to job for the other and the agents not wanting a lame DQ, Flair volunteered to come out at the finish and it would turn into a three-way at that point and Bagwell could pin Flair. In Milwaukee, Flair came out and did an interview, even though he played heel. Most of the fans cheered him, and they then had Dave Penzer say Ted Turner himself sent an emergency message for him to get on a plane to Atlanta immediately. Flair sold the message big and left, so he didn't wrestle. Flair himself liked the idea of the chemistry of himself, Hogan, Piper and Savage all together as a unit against the younger guys, but when Savage didn't want to be called an old guy and be part of that angle, it was already falling apart, and the reality is Flair would be doing the jobs for all four for the most part. Piper is just too physically beaten up because of his hip to be out there as anything more than a novelty, and really his novelty days are even pretty well past. We've got no idea about where the proposed Flair vs. Malenko and Piper vs. Bagwell matches on the pay-per-view stand. Nitro on June 28 in Chicago drew 16,210, which was about 2,500 shy of capacity, and 12,330 paid for a $373,073 house. The house isn't as impressive as it sounds, as it's Nitro not being able to sell out Chicago, and because of all the advertising and TV expenses, break even without even figuring in paying talent for the show was about $250,000. They did a tryout match with Chad Collier, who has wrestled of late for Michinoku Pro. TV opened with Benoit and Saturn over Steve Regal and David Finlay in 11 minutes when Saturn pinned Regal with the Death Valley Driver. Regal was still a little heavy and even backstage talked about not being in condition, but all things considered looked real good, especially compared to just about everyone else on the show. Easily the best match on the show and better than anything on the WWF pay-per-view the night before as well. Gene Okerlund interviewed Flair, Piper and company. Piper went crazy cutting a promo on Howard Stern blaming Stern for all the problems with kids in the United States. Flair actually said due to the political situation in the company they won't let him ever be champion again, and that was his explanation for giving David the title shot. David had his hair bleached a la Rick, but still doesn't show any charisma. Flair called out Savage and Sid, asking them to join forces with Savage, basically saying he didn't care if he had the title but just wanted to make sure Nash didn't. Flair reinstated the top rope elbow. Wasn't that already done 2 weeks ago by Nash? It was interesting because the minute Sid showed up, Arn went into a corner and acted like he didn't even want to acknowledge what was going on in front of him. Charles Robinson went crazy about Flair making a deal with Savage. When the interview was over, Sid walked to the corner where Anderson was and shook his hand. A noticeable number in the crowd understood that one and politely applauded. They did another promo of Lenny Lane and Lodi backstage doing their Gaylords gimmick. Lane acted worried that he'd lose his job if people in WCW found out about them, but recognized WCW was a progressive company. Eddie Guerrero beat Lodi in 126 with a frog splash, although Lane ran in to protect Lodi and Guerrero splashed onto both of them. Hawk, who had no voice and apparently even fewer bearings, challenged Flair. Bigelow came out instead. They had this incredibly bad match where every spot looked botched up. As a gimmick to get the hardcore match concept over and Flair over as a nutty leader, Flair has banned hardcore matches. Unfortunately, we saw just how bad Hawk is without having weapons to cover up his lack of timing in working a wrestling match. Page and Canyon both interfered and Page used a diamond cutter, allowing Bigelow to win in 4:37. Nash did an interview and got a real big pop. Nash is desperately trying to book himself as the guy alone against all odds a la Austin, and even though he's not getting over as far as his main events selling tickets, the people who come are popping for him. He said in exchange for giving David the title match, if he wanted Tori Wilson for 72 hours and said all he would need is 72 hours and she'd be ruined. At least they're doing something with Wilson, who is so marketable. Actually, the woman who plays Ryan Shamrock may be the most marketable of all of them. Nash may be using her to get him over like Dusty Rhodes used to do to hang on to his spot, but Wilson needed to be in a top program. The original plan obviously was for her to be with Rick. Hennig and Duncombe Jr. and Barry and Kendall Windham beat Stevie Ray and Horace Hogan and Vincent and Brian Adams in 7:55 when Duncombe and Kendall used a double bulldog on Vincent and Duncombe pinned him. Barry is still washing his shorts in too much warm water. This match was terrible, but Adams actually did a good dropkick and didn't look like the worst wrestler in the world in this match. Unfortunately, Stevie Ray did. Hennig is a riot and has more talent than the other 7 guys put together. The match still had no heat, and even though everyone expected Hennig to be over huge as a face because of the song, only a few people were singing it and Hennig didn't get many cheers. They had a dance contest with Miller and Disco. Miller dances much better than he wrestles. He danced. When Disco started dancing, Miller jumped him and they started a match. Remind me if I'm ever hired to run a wrestling company not to give the guy who gives my dog obedience lessons the US title. It's really not good for morale or business. The fans think Miller is so great that they were chanting for Goldberg. Disco usually isn't bad, but Miller proved Disco's limitations. Miller kicked him with the dreaded red shoe, but Jerry Flynn showed up and chased Wanu into the ring and he kicked Miller. Flynn kicked Miller and challenged him to a kickboxing match next week at the Dome. In a tag title match, Page and Canyon and Bigelow beat Malenko and Bagwell. This 3-man tag team for the regular tag titles makes as much sense this week as it did last. It was still a good match, largely because the guys in the ring worked hard and because whenever the crowd started dying down, Bigelow at ringside did a great job picking them back up. After a ref bump, Bigelow and Page did a double-team diamond cutter on Malenko for the pin in 16:29. There was a lot of heat backstage. Bagwell was complaining because he was asked to do a job for Sid in a dark match after the show ended, and Malenko was mad because when they do tag matches, Bagwell is the one who gets all the glory but he's the one who does all the work and looks bad in the finishes. They aired a Hennig video taped in Nashville on June 25th. The idea that the Wyndhams and Duncombe are actually playing musical instruments was a little hard to take, even though Barry as a kid toyed with the drums and Duncombe can play a little as well, but Hennig never sang before in his life. The song is actually getting some interest as a novelty single both from record companies and a few country stations and stations with DJs that do a lot of wrestling talk. Vicious pinned Scott Putski with a power bomb in 440. Fans were chanting Goldberg during this match as well. Savage dropped an elbow on him after the match. I can just imagine the guys in the war room putting on this show. Let's see, Vince is putting Austin versus Undertaker on top and we've got David Flair versus Nash, so we need a really strong semifinal to give us a boost, so we'll put Sid against Scott Putski. Nash versus David was beyond bad. They had all the heels as lumberjacks, Arn as ref. Basically everyone jumped Nash, who sold very little considering it was a 16-on-1 beating. David put the figure 4 on him but Nash broke it like it was a joke and started beating up everyone. David got the taser but Nash got it away and zapped David and Anderson and threatened everyone else. He then carried Gorgeous George out over his shoulder and Torrie Wilson came running away with Nash to give the impression Mr. Cool Guy is almost as cool as Tommy Dreamer and going to do his own 3-way dance. I guess he lost by count out. It must be one of those sports entertainment finishes, but at least in those they play music for no reason and we know to cheer or boo. This guy simply took off after spending 3 hours building up a 3 minutes match. Wasn't he supposed to have to win to get Torrie? When he went to his limo he saw the dreaded Hummer that nearly killed him so bad he had to sell almost 2 straight minutes for Savage. In the reflection he could see the driver. Oh my God. It's not Sable. It's not even a woman. It's Jeff Farmer. How many times have we seen this angle? For those curious, Hank Abbott is still being flown to every Nitro and is still under contract. They just don't use him. Among the people at Nitro who flew home because they weren't booked on the show were the real Sting, Rick Steiner, Conan, Rey Mysterio Jr., Kidman, Knobs, and a slew of others. There will be a Nitro Girls in Bikinis pay-per-view on August 2nd, which makes perfect sense to put a pay-per-view on a Monday night. Jimmy Hart has made a proposal to book WCW Saturday night. There's talk of building the show around only young guys and trying to do Memphis-style angles with guys who aren't on Nitro to give them experience at talking and doing programs, although at this point Kevin Sullivan is still in charge of the show and there has been no format change. There was also talk of Snoop Dogg and Naughty by Nature appearing at the Georgia Dome on July 5th, but the latter was nixed by Master P and the former was aligned with Master P, so they're probably both out. Bret Hart is planning on returning at the show. In WCW's Infinite Wisdom on Nitro this week, they never once mentioned Hart was coming back but did do an angle to build for a Miller vs. Jerry Flynn match for that show. The booking committee loves Miller, which is why he gets so much television time. It's not just that he's Bischoff's son's karate teacher. Hart is expected to leave the question of his future open in the first interview and do an angle fairly soon with Hogan to bring him back to wrestling. At first we thought it would set up Hogan vs. Hart for the Toronto pay-per-view show in November, but we're told the angle will be coming off a lot sooner than that. I don't know if people actually believe this, but there is internal talk that things will turn around when Hogan, Hart and Goldberg all return. Hogan is trying to make a play for even more political power when he returns. There are so many games being played for power by the master manipulators that I don't know if anyone knows who their allies and enemies truly are. Thunder on June 24th in Lafayette, Louisiana had a really hot crowd, and at least the show started out good. It opened with the Cowboys doing the worst lip sync you've ever seen to rap is crap. They even made fun of the fact they were so obviously doing it. Eddie Guerrero pinned Psicosis in 12:45 with a frog splash. Guerrero looked tremendous, which was good to see since he'd been out for so long, and this was only his second match back, and this was one of those great TV matches that a good promotion would use to get both guys over. In this case, well, you know the picture. Nash did an interview and was so happy with his reaction that he said he may want to move there. He's trying to make himself the rebel outlaw with the belt, which is pretty hard when you're the booker, saying how WCW doesn't want him with the title. He then said Sting drove the Hummer and the fans booed him. Benoit and Saturn beat Finlay and David Taylor in 12:01 when Benoit pinned Taylor after a diving headbutt. This was a good match. Regal showed up after the match when Finlay and Taylor were about to turn on each other and brought them back together. Hennig destroyed Lane in 3:02 when Lodi threw in the towel to save Lane. Hennig then gave Lodi a fisherman's suplex. Savage and Sid did an interview. Savage said Sid is the best big man in wrestling. Everyone else says it's Nash. That sure speaks volumes for today's wrestling, doesn't it? In the old days, the arguments for the best big man would be guys like Bruiser Brody, Don Leo Jonathan, and Vader. David Flair beat Evan Karagias in 3:31 when Evan wouldn't do the job the easy way, so they zapped him with a taser and he used the figure 4. They claimed David was undefeated with a 7-0 record and was chasing Goldberg's streak. Didn't Meng destroy him? Sorry, I remembered. Morris vs. Hammer at a hardcore match was a sports entertainment finish at 7:13. Flair came out and said no more hardcore matches. The match stopped. Then they started fighting and Hammer put Morris through a table and then Hammer just left. Main event saw Bagwell and Malenko beat Vicious and Savage via DQ in 8:29. Malenko put the cloverleaf on Miss Madness, but Sid powerbombed him. Savage then hit ref Nick Patrick for the DQ and crotched him on the top rope but totally missed the spot. They gave Mickey J a stuffed piledriver and a powerbomb and Jay ended up getting hurt legit on the move. For next week they taped Kaz Hayashi and Kenny Chaos over the Border Patrol, Saturn over DDP with outside interference, Brad Armstrong and Swollen over disorderly conduct, Guerrero beat Parka, Hennig and Duncombe and Wyndham's beat Silver King and Damien and Dandy and Villano V. Mysterio Jr. kept the Cruiserweight belt beating Blitzkrieg. Benoit over Enos, and the main event saw Rick Steiner beat Bagwell when David Flair zapped him with the taser. Oh well, on Nitro Nash stole the taser from David. I'm just glad I'm not going to have to try to make sense of it on TV this week. There is nothing new on the status of Jericho, who worked road shows putting over Bagwell all weekend. He's got 2 or 3 house show bookings left and at this point isn't going to be used on television unless he signs a new deal. WCW is making a play for him after really not even trying to keep him for the past 6 months. The booking committee wants to put him on Nitro every week to job to everyone in case he leaves, but Bischoff ruled against it with the idea that he didn't want to give him any television exposure in case he leaves. The situation is being handled totally different to when Scott Steiner's contract was running out, but he was still pushed big on TV every week, or even when Giant left and they still used him fairly strong on TV, although that was more so DDP and Nash could beat him when he still meant something before he left. Starting this week, the wrestlers who were on the road did get paid bonuses for doing the house shows, generally in the $250 to $500 range. This had been talked about for some time since morale is so bad about the highest paid guys not having to work house shows but getting so much of the television time. Miller and Scott Armstrong nearly got into a fight backstage at the June 22nd show in Lake Charles, Louisiana. They actually did a Barry Windham vs. Mysterio Jr. match at that taping. Windham was DQ'd for outside interference. Windham sold a lot more for Mysterio Jr. than he did in the Taka Michinoku match last year on Raw, which pretty well destroyed for good the WWF's light heavyweight division. Apparently when Sting said, "I've got 2 words for you," and the crowd responded, "Suck it," in New Orleans on June 21st, he thought the cameras were off. Boy, did that come off as one lame finish of a TV show. Despite rumors to the contrary, Raven is still with the company. He's had surgery in recent weeks to repair a torn rotator cuff and also had surgery for gynecomastia, where nipples swell and males grow almost female breast-like tissue, often attributed to using steroids that aromatize in the system, and he got an infection from the second surgery and was hospitalized again during the past week. WCW had a surprise drug test at the house show in Milwaukee. This was another morale killer because virtually none of the big names were at the show, as seems to be the case more often than not when these drug tests take place. For June 11th in the UK, Raw set its all-time record rating with 480,000 viewers to 240,000 for Nitro and 170,000 for Thunder. Hugh Morris had a large chunk fall out of his head, hair and all, during his Thunder match with Van Hammer on June 24th. It wasn't exactly his week, since he also had 2 car wrecks during the week. Apparently Sid is telling people he signed a 2-year deal for $1.5 million per, but others who are probably, but not necessarily, more reliable peg the real figure at $500,000 per year. Bob Raceman in the New York Daily News ripped on the Hogan interview on Larry King, saying it was obvious Hogan went on with a clear agenda, and ripped on CNN for giving him the full hour. It's not definite, but Shane Douglas may be debuting on July 5th. The main event for the Georgia Dome, which is expected to draw around 18,000, is Nash vs. Vicious for the title. WCW has signed 21 new wrestlers in recent weeks to developmental deals ranging from $300 to $1,000 per week, which tie the wrestlers to WCW for 3 years, but the company can basically cut the wrestlers at its will. Besides Shane Helms and Shannon Moore, another guy signed was Jerry Toot, who has wrestled Jersey Indies as the Hellraiser and is 6'8", 300 plus. The wrestlers are to work security at the Nitros and go to the power plant 5 days per week. There's a lot of criticism since the power plant has turned out so few wrestlers and basically hasn't on its own groomed anyone who would be ranked as a good worker. Public Enemy is back. Johnny Grunge wrestled in Auburn Hills, Michigan on June 26th against Hawk, and Rocco Rock was at the show backstage. There's talk about putting them in as a group with Douglas and Hawk. Damien will be undergoing an operation because of a badly broken thumb suffered in that hardcore match on Nitro that Tony Schiavone and Bobby Heenan were laughing their way through. Bischoff wasn't at either the Thunder of Nitro tapings this past week. Since he's usually not at Thunder, it's not a big deal, but there was considerable reaction to his missing Nitro. Shows for the past week saw Saturday night tapings on June 22nd in Lake Charles, Louisiana drew 4,532, paying $91,895, which at this point is a good crowd for Saturday night tapings. June 23rd in Alexandria, Louisiana drew 2,991, paying $55,075. Thunder on June 24th in Lafayette, Louisiana drew a sellout 10,634, which was $9,781, paying $202,335. June 25th in Auburn Hills, Michigan at the Palace drew 5,125, paying $168,837. In the building it wouldn't have looked so bad because there were 9,500 in the building with comps, since they papered it to avoid it looking bad in such a huge building. June 26th in Fort Wayne, Indiana drew 2,909, paying $74,150, and June 27th in Milwaukee drew 2,722, paying $76,370. DJ Ran and some of the Nitro girls are now on the road at the house shows. DJ Ran is starting to get booed in some cities. Mike Weber, who worked in the front office, gave notice for a job working with Monster Truck Promotions. La Parka was limping noticeably after his match in Milwaukee. New Japan is wanting to send Kenzo Suzuki, a former college rugby star, to WCW and to Calgary for early seasoning before debuting in Japan. For the 8-show period from June 21st in New Orleans through June 28th in Chicago, merchandise was $310,449 or $5.55 per head. In an article in the June 25th Fort Lauderdale Sun-Sentinel by Alex Merves, Bischoff admitted WCW fell asleep at the wheel after the NWO gimmick ran its course and blamed WWF for changing audience expectations for current problems. The WWF raised the bar in terms of expectations of the audience in a way this company has decided we're not going to compete with. It's an audience who really doesn't care about advertising and long-term business growth. All they want to do is be entertained, shocked, surprised, and have something to talk about Tuesday morning when they go to school or work. WWF. Judging from the TV, it appears the July 25th fully loaded pay-per-view lineup will go something along the lines of Austin vs. Undertaker in a First Blood match for the title, Chyna and Mr. Ass vs. Road Dogg and X-Pac, Kane, going heel back with Undertaker vs. Big Show, perhaps Acolytes vs. Hardy Boys, and since both are left without an opponent, it leaves Triple H vs. Rock, and probably throw in Shamrock vs. Blackman in some sort of a gimmick match, and maybe Test vs. Joey Obbs, the new Mean Street Posse character, real name Jason Arndt, and Mideon, now as European champ, defending against Brown. Tickets were put on sale for the Raw on October 11th at the Georgia Dome on June 25th. which is the WWF's first appearance in the Atlanta market in about 8 years. WWF went all out with the local promotion, sending Austin, Rock and Jim Ross among others to hit all the media, and resulted in selling 19,395 tickets for $548,151 on the first day, almost guaranteeing it'll be either the biggest or second biggest to the Skydome Raw in February, Raw event in history. They were well over the 21,000 mark in sales by the end of the weekend. Raw on June 28 from Charlotte drew a sellout 19,553, which was 18,560, paying $486,325. The show opened with a CM celebration and Shane firing Austin, as if, but I guess only firing him as CEO. Vince said that Austin would become a prelim wrestler and part of the ring crew, but Austin claimed he had a CEO before losing the match at the pay-per-view, signed himself for a WWF title match which would take place later in the show, and also to a big contract. Earlier, McMahon had promised Triple H a title match at the next pay-per-view, and they had a deal where Bossman came out, but ended up hugging the McMahon, so that angle from last week has already been erased. Pam must have been having a lot of bad dreams. Shamrock vs. Blackman went 249 with a sports entertainment finish. Shamrock was selling the idea of internal injuries, ran out the ring anyway. Blackman destroyed him with a stick, and then with Shamrock bleeding even worse from the mouth this time, Blackman just walked off. Mr. Ass did an interview. Triple H and Chyna came out and said X-Pac and Road Dogg were getting all the DX merchandise money. He said he's putting Chyna with Billy to go after Dogg and X-Pac. I'm not sure what that actually has to do with merchandise money. I guess if they beat them up they get their merchandise money. Beaver and Mama Cleaver this week were Chaz Warrington, and last week's Mama is this week's girlfriend Mariana. Chaz said he's just Chaz from New Jersey and used to be a spider, a headbanger, hairy beaver cleavage, and a sister of love. This appears even more to send the message that if you're in the WWF and you don't like your gimmick, you just don't do it and everything is fine. It's a form of subtle Owen Hart damage control for the public and also dumping a bad gimmick at the same time. They showed Test kissing Stephanie McMahon and actually made a real big deal about it. Chaz beat Meat in 201 with a torture rack into a slam. Mariana shoved Terry Runnels at the finish. Why do I think whoever came up with the idea for Meat to wear that underwear as a ring outfit used to live in San Francisco? The Mean Street Posse beat up Test. Bob Holly beat Kane in 127 after Big Show choke slammed him. After the match, Kane got up and choke slammed Holly 4 times. Rock beat Triple H via DQ in 140 when Mr. S hit him with a club. They did a local TV ad for the next show in San Jose, which is a Friday night house show, but the ad gives the impression it's a Raw taping. From what I understand, at this point in the show in the Philadelphia market, when they were plugging the next house show, they mentioned that Austin would be defending the title in the main event, and this was before he'd won it. They also ran 2 interesting WWF.com ads, one of which showed a guy picking his nose and another showed a guy about to get a hand shoved up his butt. Edge beat Godfather in 205. Albert gave Godfather his dreaded Wadata maneuver and Edge pinned him. Draws and Prince Albert came out and were about to pierce one of the hoes' mouths, but Edge made the save and she left with Edge. They were making a big deal out of her, so she may be a recurring character with Edge. Bradshaw pinned Mr. Ass to get his tag title belt back when both Farouk and X-Pac interfered in 306. Chyna jumped X-Pac after and Dogg made the save and decked Chyna. Ivory came out with Nicole Bass and challenged anyone in the house. She made some remarks about having a champion who could actually wrestle, where? Obviously aimed at Sable. A plant ran out, Malia Hasaka, and they did a thing where security wouldn't let her in, but Ivory asked Jim Dotson if they seemed to be building up for an angle because they made a big deal about him to let her go. Bass power bombed her. She was wearing a short dress, so you got the requisite ass shot. Ivory clotheslined her out of her dress. Bass and Dotson seemed to have words. Jarrett kept the IC title, beating X-Pac in 501. This match blew away anything on the pay-per-view. A very hot short match. Mr. Ass ran in. Deborah undid her top. X-Pac hit Jarrett with the guitar, but Mr. Ass used the famouser on X-Pac, allowing Jarrett to get the pin. Road Dogg ran in after Mr. Ass, but Chyna ran in and they brawled again. Finally, Austin pinned Undertaker to regain the title in 12:03 with a stunner. He did a stunner about a minute earlier, but Paul Bearer pulled Earl Hebner out of the ring before the 3 count. Austin decked Bearer and used the stunner again. Match was good and the pops for Austin's big spots were huge. Taker destroyed Austin with the belt after the match and Austin juiced heavily. Harvey Whippleman was back doing the heel ref gimmick on Shotgun, taped earlier that night, trying to help Brooklyn Brawler win the hardcore title from Snow, but Snow still wound up winning. From June 29th in Fayetteville, North Carolina taping. It opened with a dark match with Kurt Angle beating Chuck Coates with a torture rack dropped into a Death Valley driver, which was a totally sick move the few times I've seen Kenta Kobashi do it. For Sunday Night Heat for this week, the Hardy Boys beat X-Pac and Kane via DQ when Acolytes attacked Boys. X-Pac and Kane helped out the Hardy Boys since the interference had cost them the match, and Kane gave Bradshaw the tombstone on the ring steps. Mideon beat Snow via DQ in a European title match when Brown attacked Mideon, since Brown doesn't want anyone to beat Mideon for the title before he gets it. Test beat Jarrett via DQ in an IC title match when Joey Obbs and the Posse attacked Test and left him laying. Holly challenged anyone in the back who was at least 6'6" and 400 pounds. So Viscera accepted. Holly hit him with a chair shot. Kane came out and choke slammed Holly. Big Show came out while Undertaker also came out and had a stare down with Kane, and I guess used the old supernatural powers to convince Kane to join him again. Austin agreed to Taker's earlier challenge for a first blood match on the pay-per-view for the title. Austin versus Undertaker again? Vince said that if Undertaker wins, Austin never gets another title shot. If Austin wins, Vince will never interfere in any of Austin's business. Godfather and Venus beat Prince Albert and Droz in a match where if Albert and Droz lost, they'd have to become hoes for a day. I guess this idea stemmed from Godfather working an indie show on June 25th in Howell, New Jersey, and they dressed up 400-pound Mark Mest as a hoe. Road Dogg NC show when Kane attacked Show. Dog tried to get Kane to stop, but Kane choke slammed him. X-Pac then came out and convinced Kane to leave. On Raw, Hardy Boys won the tag titles when Matt hit Bradshaw with a cane given to him by Michael Hayes and pinned him with a tornado DDT. Godfather came out, with Droz and Albert as hoes, and beat Gangrel. After the match, Gangrel, Droz and Albert all attacked Godfather and Venus. Christian and Edge made the save, leading to Gangrel shoving Edge. Snow pinned Brown in a hardcore title match by splashing him through a table. Chyna filed a police report claiming X-Pac and Dog had graffitied up her car and demanded that they both get arrested. Just what we need is some more arrests, since both companies stopped doing the weekly arrests after running that gimmick into the ground a few months back. Jarrett kept the IC title beating Chaz. They had Deborah and Mariana going at each other. Jarrett went to hit Chaz with a guitar when out of the crowd came Glenn Ruth for the save. Test NC Joey Obbs when the entire Mean Street Posse destroyed Test. Shane made Stephanie watch. After they all left, Stephanie went to help Test. Dog NC Venus ended when the police showed up in the middle of the match and carted away X-Pac and Dog. Edge pinned Bossman after a spear. After the bout, Bossman attacked Edge. Mr. Ass beat Meat. Chyna laid out Jacqueline with a DDT, and after the match, Ass and Chyna spray painted Meat and Jacqueline DX, and played the old DX theme music. A handicap match with Show and Holly vs. Kane ended when Undertaker came out and distracted Show so Kane could choke slam and pin Holly. After the match, Kane and Undertaker joined forces to attack Show, including giving him a double suplex and bloodying him up after a chair shot. Main event saw Rock beat Triple H in a cage match. The ref was bumped and Triple H actually climbed out first. Rock climbed out after, and they brawled outside the ring. They got back in and the ref recovered. It was one of those photo finishes as Rock climbed over to win just before Triple H hit the floor going out the door. After the match, Gunn hit Rock with the Famouser and the two laid out Rock. After the show went off the air, Rock made a comeback and laid out both of them with the People's Elbow. WWF The Music this week was at number 130 on the charts with 12,855 units sold. Insane Clown Posse on their website this week claim they are going to the WWF. Shawn Michaels appears on 2 episodes of Pacific Blue, which air August 1st and August 8th. It's official that the name Over the Edge has been dropped as a future pay-per-view event. WWF is now changing its pay-per-view marketing from the idea of 5 major events and 7 minor shows to the idea of 11 major shows and 1 WrestleMania. All of the events will have a name that continues every year. The Bad Blood name was dropped after the death of Brian Pillman prior to that show. Jim Cornette is moving this week to Louisville to help run Dan Briley's Ohio Valley Championship Wrestling, which will use a lot of WWF guys on developmental deals, with the idea they'll start in Louisville for a few months, then move to Memphis, then move to WWF. On the WWF's King of the Ring website, they have photos from all the different PPVs. They showed a photo of the year Mabel won it, and underneath is a caption that reads, "What were we thinking?" Kevin Kelly and Michael Cole will be the announcers for the SmackDown show, which officially starts on UPN on August 26th. That pretty well makes it clear that Raw will stay as the A show. The new member of the Mean Street Posse is Jason Arndt. Among the names they are considering for him are Heater and Joey Obbs. The only house show of the week was Madison Square Garden, which sold out weeks in advance with 16,453 paying $443,224. Between MSG and Charlotte they did $215,456 in merchandise, which was $6.15 per head. MSG saw Christian and Edge over Henry and Brown when Christian pinned Henry. Gangrel was at ringside but is a little banged up, so didn't wrestle this weekend. Godfather beat Mideon in a short match. Vince came out and said he was going to apologize for the abysmal performance of the Knicks and Rangers, and also wanted to apologize for Austin because he wasn't going to win over Undertaker and, like the other teams, would let the fans down. Snow won a three-way over Blackman and Holly by pinning Blackman in a hardcore match. Shamrock beat Jarrett via countout. Finish was really weird. Deborah took off her top, which allowed Jarrett to escape the ankle lock, and he just left. Shamrock, after the countout, chased Jarrett down, threw him back in and put the hold on again. Shamrock then chased Howard Finkel around. Rock beat Bossman with the nightstick on the pole. Bossman got the stick but Test got it away from him. Rock did a people's elbow with the nightstick for the win. Big Show beat Triple H after a choke slam. Viscera beat Venus with a splash after Base distracted Venus. Mr. Ass beat Dog with the Famouser after Chyna gave Dog a low blow. Best match on show. Acolytes beat X-Pac and Kane in another good match. Finish was Austin over Taker via DQ. Austin hit the stunner but Paul Bearer attacked Earl Hebner for the title-saving DQ. Godfather worked in Indy and Howell, New Jersey on June 25th, and Mark Mest, who weighs about 400 pounds, came out without a shirt as a hoe. Terry Taylor is trying to sign undiscovered talent to developmental deals and pitching people on the idea he wants to get a light heavyweight division going, but with Vince as a size freak and others in the office against it, it's not a good bet to be taken seriously. WWF will do another UK pay-per-view show on October 2nd called Rebellion from Manchester. Rena Mero is getting flooded with media requests to talk about the WWF direction and her lawsuit. The audience for Raw has grown 166% over the past 2 years after bottoming out in 1997. Raw magazine won a first-place award for Best Cover for the September 1998 issue, with Rock's face designed as part of Mount Rushmore out of 700 entries of magazines with circulation between 100,000 and 399,000. Victor Quiñones ran an IWA show with mostly WWF talent on June 25th at Hiram Bithorn Stadium in San Juan, Puerto Rico, before an estimated 15,000 fans. Val Venus did his mic work in Spanish, which got over big. Undertaker and Big Show went to a double count out in the main event, which disappointed the fans. After the match, Undertaker challenged Rock for a match on the next tour. There was a huge article on WWF Canada President Carl DeMarco in the Financial Post magazine section of the Canadian National Post. The story starts out like it's going to be a positive piece, but pretty much takes DeMarco's quotes and numbers and make fun of their suspect accuracy throughout. They didn't make fun of the $1 billion figure WWF supposedly grosses in merchandise alone, considering the entire gross from all forms of revenue is about $230 million. That would be rather difficult. The article talked about the popularity of catch play sets and of WWF t-shirts, which did $6 million in Canadian business over the past 9 months. But the story said pro wrestling faces a number of challenges before it can start boasting about corporate respectability, noting it doesn't have the deep-pocketed advertisers, noting Roots Canada and Nike both saying they don't even consider working with pro wrestling. Tag Heuer, the Swiss sports watch company which pays big money to the likes of Boris Becker and Grant Hill, said it steers clear of WWF because it considers it too low-end, and Tag only wants to be associated with elite sports. It said even with its popularity, WWF is still considered as having a demographic not highly valued by mainstream advertisers and corporate sponsors. The story had the new WWF propaganda line that McMahon merged with local wrestling companies to build his empire, rather than he simply ran them out of business. The story noted that the soft porn elements are one of the advantages WWF has over real sports. The story claimed, "Don't you love history, that WCW was formed in 1989 and lured away WWF superstars like Ric Flair, Savage, and Hogan." DeMarco compared WCW to WWF as saying it's like comparing the NHL to Pee Wee hockey. DeMarco bragged about the WWF's drug policy. The reporter didn't know it's almost non-existent these days, and claimed homophobic taunts are out. The reporter recognized seeing too much as act on the show that wasn't the case and brought it up with DeMarco, saying he never knew the characters they played were intended to be gay. DeMarco brought up the WWF being seen by 500 million viewers a week, numbers Nielsen research claimed one should be very skeptical of. It talked about a house show in Vancouver where there were 3,200 empty seats, but DeMarco still insisted it was a sellout. It said only WWF and Icecapades draw audiences that young. It then noted that 2 nights earlier a larger crowd paid double the WWF's ticket prices to watch a meaningless end-of-the-season game between the Canucks and Calgary Flames, both of which were eliminated from any contention. It noted that hockey had corporate sponsors everywhere, a press gallery filled with reporters and skyboxes were filled. The WWF had a few reporters and almost all the skyboxes were deserted. It noted the WWF scores great with teenagers but isn't considered a good buy for older and more affluent consumers as compared with the NHL, NBA, and NASCAR. A new Michael Jordan video has for the past 2 weeks knocked Steve Austin off the #1 spot in the video charts after 28 weeks. Austin's videos remained number 2 and number 3. WWF's Rock video debuted at number 7, while WCW's new releases, Kevin Nash and NWO for Life, were number 8 and number 9. Of the top 20, WWF was down to 9, WCW had 4, and a 14th wrestling video was the A&E History Special. The Reader's Pages. WCW. Recently on WCW Live, Ric Flair posted an interesting question. Who exactly is too old in wrestling today? Flair is 50. He is not the best wrestler in the world anymore, but he is still a tremendous wrestler and can have great matches with just about anyone when he isn't being buried. Randy Savage is in his late 40s. His physique is impressive, but he's lost nearly all of his in-ring ability. Hulk Hogan is Hulk Hogan. DDP is in his 40s, but he can have awesome matches. You can't take that away from him. Kevin Nash is in his 40s and his matches suck because he doesn't put any effort into them. Lex Luger and Sting are in their early 40s, but nobody calls them old guys. So what is old? Is it when a wrestler reaches a certain age? Is it when a wrestler has wrestled for X amount of years? Or is it when fans are sick of the same old faces without any semblance of upward movement for the younger stars? As far as age goes, Flair is still strong. I remember watching Nick Bockwinkel when I was 7 years old go to a 60-minute draw with Curt Hennig in Las Vegas in a fantastic match. I believe he was in his mid-50s at the time. So he couldn't have been too old. It can't be when someone simply has wrestled 20 years. The wrestlers that everyone in wrestling suggests are too old are the ones who destroyed their staying power themselves by hogging the spotlight. That brings us to WCW. This is a company in shambles and everyone is blaming the old guys. Much of the blame should be placed at Hogan and Nash for burying just about everyone else in the company. Hogan and Nash are a detriment to the company because they buried everyone, not because they are old. Most believe the only solution is for WCW to get rid of Piper, Hogan, and Flair. I believe that's the worst solution. The best solution is the course WCW has started, but the question is will they finish it correctly? It's the young versus old program. The passing of the torch has to be a transitional period, not a sudden jolt. Firing the established stars would leave WCW with a group of tremendous athletes that the fans won't buy on top because of a lack of a transition period. Fans need to see Benoit, Malenko and Kidman feud with Flair, Piper, Luger, Sting, Hogan, and Nash. I bet Hogan and Nash want no part of such a program for all the reasons that everyone already knows about. Someone in the company has to take a stand and say that this is the focus of the company. Whoever doesn't want to be a part of it can go home. A good booker should know that there are ways to book the program to where both sides come out looking strong. The reason the current main eventers are apprehensive about working with the young guys is because they don't want to lose their spot. So they book their own angles and segregate everyone else from the main programs. Why can't WCW sit down and draw out a 6-month program that builds to Starrcade with Benoit and Malenko coming out looking like the stars they can be, and Piper and Flair establishing their legacy by putting up a good fight trying to hold on and finish out their careers in glory? This program could easily fill 6 strong pay-per-view shows and a great War Games. So what is old? It's not age. It's not ability, because this is wrestling where very rarely the most talented are the ones who get ahead. What's old are the wrestlers in WCW who don't realize the legacy they are trying to protect gets diminished every time they bury a young wrestler. Nilton Fernandez. Winnipeg, Manitoba. I've tried to hang in there, but WCW is virtually unwatchable. It reminds me of an out-of-control revolving door full of people I could care less about. Just like in movies, you need to have strong, identifiable characters with a logical script to keep the viewer's interest. In WCW, the angles and switches come way too frequently with no logic and desperation changes. In the past 6 months, all the members of the Four Horsemen have turned at least 3 times each. The final and saddest moment has been the demise of the career of Ric Flair. I had always hoped he would leave wrestling with his head held high, but he's crash-landed in a sea of inane skits that has made him finish his career looking like a fool. John Bamberger. Larkspur, California. The June 14th Nitro has now firmly established as the show where the desperate man in the industry that Eric Bischoff has spoken about for years was finally unmasked as Eric Bischoff. However, in his commentary it seems Bischoff is repenting for his sins past and present, giving, as he put it, a WCW Universal audience what it wants in the form of Sid Eudy, Rena Mero and Percy Miller to attempt to reverse the lopsided battles WCW has been losing in 1999. There are a few things Eric didn't cover, however. He didn't tell Percy Miller that this isn't Rap City, his promos can't be cut in Bama-fied style syntax, that nobody on the East Coast or the West Coast, including the rest of us in the black community, give a about him, and unless X-Lax, Senecott, Tums and Pepto-Bismol plan on becoming WCW sponsors, his catchphrase, "UCK" shouldn't be used as a t-shirt slogan but an expression by the WCW audience when watching Nash and Sid plot their way through another main event. Ray Barr. Hemingway, South Carolina. It's ironic, just a few years ago I was writing about how the WWF needed to change to improve their product. 2 years later, I'm writing the same thing about WCW. They need to have storylines that make sense. Is the NWO Red and Black still together? Why is Lodi watching jobber matches? Why did Sting challenge Randy Savage when he should be challenging the Steiners or Tank Abbott? Why was Tank Abbott the focus of an entire Nitro show and the next 2 television shows never mentioned? Why did Canyon join DDP and Bigelow? Why did Rick Steiner join Scott Steiner? Why hasn't Randy Savage gone after Eric Bischoff, who destroyed his knee last year? WCW needs to dump Kevin Nash as Booker and get someone like Vince Russo or Ed Ferreira to write storylines that make sense. It isn't the old guys that are bringing WCW down. It's the bad storylines. They need to pink slip guys who are useless, like the entire NWO Black and White, Bobby Duncombe Jr., Barbarian, Meng, Roddy Piper, he can be kept as a commissioner, Hugh Morris, Kurt Hennig, Van Hammer, and Prince Iaukea. They need to sign Chris Jericho. Give him what he wants. They pay all the crappy wrestlers listed above yet they can't sign Jericho? Cancel Thunder or Saturday Night. Too many jobber matches with no storyline that nobody cares about. Have a gorgeous George vs. Tori Wilson feud, bikini contests, evening gown matches, etc. These women blow away the women in the WWF. They can be marketing goldmines. Medusa vs. Elizabeth feud would be nice as well. Only put people on Nitro that are planned to be pushed. If WCW keeps putting on matches with wrestlers nobody cares about, fans can't get attached to new characters. Build up matches on pay-per-view that lead to something. Have Goldberg or Jericho as WCW champion. Nash has been a failure as Booker and champion. The announcers need to stop talking so much. On Nitro, they show the announcers talking for several minutes. People switch the channel. I agree with you 100% that the pay-per-view show should have been cancelled. Vince McMahon as the higher power made no sense. Mike Malisev. Detroit, Michigan. Is there any truth to the rumor that the new TBS series, The Chimp Channel, is actually showing footage of a WCW booking committee meeting? Andy Johnson. Fairfield, California. I'm getting concerned about the ageism that I see creeping into the pages of The Observer lately. You're always harping on Bobby Heenan and others for cultural references more than 10 years old. Please. Do we all have to wear droopy drawers and spout retarded hip-hop slang like Conan? I prefer to think of Heenan's references as his tribute to the golden age of wrestling. Do you realize he used to manage Bobby Duncombe Jr.'s father? 2 weeks ago, you wrote that people who remembered a Southwest Championship Wrestling angle from 1983 was either old or had a great memory. I believe that you and I are about the same ago, and I recall that angle vividly. I know which one I am. Which one are you? Scott Cornish. New Hartford, New York. I guess David Flair proved once and for all that charisma does indeed skip a generation. Was the WCW limo/Hummer wreck more or less dangerous than the Owen Hart wire drop? Obviously it was just as stupid and useless to the storyline. There was absolutely no interest or concern when WCW canceled its house show in Rochester, New York. But here is an interesting order of events to show how not to promote a house show. WWF holds a sold-out house show on March 21st. They then immediately put tickets on sale for a September 4th show and advertise it for a few weeks. WCW soon after announces a show for June 9th. Then they wait to put tickets on sale less than 3 weeks before the show. They didn't do any noticeable local advertising. Meanwhile, the WWF continues to hype their show in September. Nobody buys WCW tickets. They sell less than 900. The show is cancelled with no fanfare or concern. Another sellout is expected for the WWF. I honestly think wrestling fans are overestimating the general public's concern or outrage over the Owen Hart tragedy. It's already a distant memory and will be totally forgotten with the next entertainment industry death. Does Eric Bischoff actually think an on-air pissing contest with WWF will win back fans? And to have any WCW announcer have the audacity to comment on Jim Ross announcing is ridiculous. Does TNN really think a substantial number of wrestling viewers will stay tuned after ECW to watch Roller Jam? I have to think they will have to juice up Roller Jam so that it is closer to what modern wrestling is and what fans want if they have any hopes of increasing viewership. Do you think more kids get injured every year by imitating pro wrestling or by trying X Games type stunts on their bikes, skateboard and rollerblades? Sean Hendrick. Rochester, New York. Response from Dave Meltzer. Obviously the limo wreck was tons safer than the Owen Hart drop. As far as general public outrage and concern, that's over, but the perception in the general public's mouth for wrestling has changed greatly in the last 5 weeks, and that continues to this day, which I'm reminded of every time I go shopping, to the bank and to the post office. Obviously more kids get injured doing a lot of things than imitating pro wrestling, which is why those stories about the dangers of imitating pro wrestling for kids never include interviews with doctors in hospitals about the rash of injuries that are newly occurring. Sable. I find the accusations that Sable described disgusting. Whether she's a prima donna or not, she shouldn't have to put up with such crude, vulgar harassment. I realize the Owen Hart tribute television show was just damage control for Vince McMahon, but I hope in my heart that the talent that talked about Owen meant what they said. If anyone didn't, it truly was a very sick version of OJ giving a tribute for Nicole. Pamela Glad. Pinellas Park, Florida. The implant lady sure has a lot of, implants, with her lawsuit. If I was her, I'd probably do the same thing, but unsafe working environment. What work did she ever do? The plastic surgeons did all the work, ballooning her breasts with those horrible things and cramming her jawline practically under her eyeballs. Now the lawyers are doing the rest of the work. Peepholes in the dressing room? Someone whose job it was to have the biggest breasts and sexually tease people with them is complaining about a peephole? It's not Vince McMahon's fault that TV land is so bereft of formerly entertaining programs like original dramas, involving characters, musical performances, skits and sketches that TV fans turn to wrestling to get their circus fix. Also, why do you always knock the old guys like Curt Hennig, Barry Windham and Dusty Rhodes? I love Dusty Rhodes. I don't care how dumb, ignorant or childish that makes me in your eyes. Scott Hudson and Mike Tenay are the two worst announcers in the history of broadcast sports. Dusty Rhodes could announce my obituary and I'd enjoy it. Barry Windham had more wrestling talent than anybody. You're knocking his shorts? These people have thrilled me for 20 years, so stop picking on them. Alan Wunsch. New York, New York.